The dawn broke not with a gentle blush, but with a hard, metallic glare across bitterbrush flats. It was a light that offered no warmth, only exposure, laying bare the cracked earth and the bones of a land gasping for water. Wind, the territory's oldest resident, scoured the plains, pushing a fine grit of dust against the splintered posts of the Vale Ranch fence. Each gust sounded like a dry whisper, a constant reminder of decay. The fence leaned, tired and broken in places, a testament to a long fight against a relentless siege of drought and solitude. Cora Vale stood in the thin light, her form casting a long, lonely shadow that stretched toward the withered heart of her property. She was a woman shaped by this land, just shy of 30, but with the hard-won stillness of someone much older. The sun had browned her shoulders to the color of worn leather and bleached streaks in her tightly bound hair, but it had not been able to touch the color of her eyes. They were the gray-blue of a stormy sky over the mountains, holding a depth of resilience that the parched landscape around her had long since surrendered, one by one. She counted the cattle, her gaze lingering on the stark prominence of their ribs. They were ghosts of the herd her father had built, thinned by the endless dry spell that had choked the life from the creeks and burned the grass to brittle straw. The decision had settled in her heart overnight, as heavy and cold as a stone. It was a choice born of desperation, a last, painful severance. The horses would have to go. Her father's prize stock, the animals she had raised from foals, their spirits as much a part of the ranch as the creak of the windmill. But the water tax, a cruel invention of the territorial council, was due, and the note at Ephraim Deacon's bank in Ashwind Station was looming. Selling the horses was not just a financial transaction. It felt like selling off pieces of her own history, a final admission that she was losing the battle her father had entrusted to her, miles away. In the dim wood-paneled office of the Ashwind Station Bank, that very battle was being discussed in hushed, confident tones. Ephraim Deacon's, a man whose softness of body was belied by the flint-hard calculation in his eyes, swirled a glass of whiskey he would not drink until the deal was done. Across the mahogany desk from him sat Clint Renshaw, a cattle baron whose vast herds were somehow immune to the drought that plagued smaller ranches. Renshaw was a man built of grizzle and greed, his face a roadmap of hard bargains and sun-scorched dominance. "She's auctioning the horses," Deacon said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "The last of her real assets. The water tax will take most of it. The rest, well, the rest won't last her through the season." Renshaw grunted, a sound of predatory satisfaction. "It's time. Then I want that spring. Deacons, my herds are moving east, and I need the water." "You shall have it," Deacons assured him, a thin smile touching his lips. Ghost Lantern Spring, a poetic name for a piece of land that will soon belong to a far more practical enterprise. "We apply pressure today. My man at the auction will ensure the prices are disappointing. Sheriff Cutter will remind her of her civic duties. By sundown, she'll understand that her only viable option is to sell the spring to the Renshaw Trust for a price we deem fair." He finally took a sip of his whiskey. It was the taste of inevitability. The town square of Ashwind Station baked under the late morning sun, a cauldron of dust, sweat, and nervous energy. Cora stood beside the auction pen, her back straight as a fence post, refusing to show the tremor of anxiety that ran through her. She could feel the eyes of the town on her, could hear the whispers that slithered through the crowd. "A woman's got no business running a spread that big," one rancher muttered to another, loud enough for her to hear. "Can't hold on to water, can't hold on to a man." The words were meant to sting, to chip away at her composure. But Cora held her ground. Her hand rested on the worn, folded deed in her pocket, the paper soft as cloth from years of handling. It was her only armor. Inside the pen, Salt Cedar, her prized white stallion, tossed his head, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. He was a magnificent creature, a flash of pure white against the drab brown of the dusty enclosure, his spirit too big for this small, loud place. As the auctioneer began his patter, one of Renshaw's men, a lanky cowboy with a cruel sneer, deliberately stepped forward and gave the stallion's lead rope a vicious jerk, The horse reared, screaming, his hooves lashing the air. The crowd gasped and fell back. It was a deliberate act of sabotage, designed to make the horse look wild and untrainable, to drive the price down into the dirt. Renshaw, watching from the shade of the general store's porch, allowed himself a small, smug smile. The bidding sputtered, low and hesitant. The price stalled at an insulting figure, not even enough to cover a month's worth of feed, let alone the crushing tax. Cora's heart sank. This was worse than she had imagined. It wasn't just a sale, it was a public humiliation. Then, a voice cut through the murmur of the crowd, clear and steady. $100. A collective silence fell over the square. Heads turned, searching for the source of the impossible bid. A man stepped out from the shadow of the blacksmith's forge. He was tall, with the broad shoulders of someone who worked with iron and fire. His face was unreadable, his clothes simple and worn, and his hands were stained with the black soot of his trade. He moved with a quiet economy, a stillness that seemed out of place in the nervous energy of the crowd. Cora stared at him. She'd seen him at the forge, hammering steel into shape, but she didn't know his name. He was a stranger. "That's Rowan Pike," someone whispered. "The new smithy, ex-cavalry." Deakins, who had been observing the proceedings with detached satisfaction, frowned. He made a neat, precise note in the small leather-bound ledger he always carried. This was an unexpected variable, an unwelcome complication. Pike's bid was more than the horse was worth in this drought-stricken market. It was a move that made no financial sense. The auctioneer, flustered, looked to Renshaw's man, who simply shrugged, his sneer faltering. Renshaw himself spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, his eyes narrowing on the blacksmith. $100. Going once. The auctioneer called out, his voice regaining its rhythm. Going twice. No other bids came. The hammer fell with a sharp crack that echoed the tension in the air. Sold to Mr. Pike. The crowd broke into a low buzz of speculation. Rowan Pike walked to the clerk's table, counted out the gold coins with his soot-stained fingers, and took the bill of sale. He then walked directly to the pen, his movements calm and deliberate. He didn't use the rope. He spoke to the horse in a low, soothing voice, and after a moment, the magnificent salt-cedar lowered his head and allowed the stranger to stroke his neck. Cora watched, a storm of confusion, relief, and wounded pride raging within her. When Rowan led the horse out of the pen and approached her, she found her voice. "I don't know what game you're playing, mister," she said, her tone clipped and defensive. "But I'm selling a horse, not my dignity." Rowan Pike looked at her, his gaze direct and serious. It was the first time she had seen his eyes up close. They were the color of slate, steady and deep. "I wasn't buying either one, ma'am," he replied, his voice a low baritone. "I was buying you time." Before Cora could process the meaning of his words, another figure inserted himself between them. Sheriff Boaz Cutter, a man whose gut strained the buttons of his vest, moved with the swagger of someone who knew his authority was backed by the town's real power. A greasy smile played on his lips, but his eyes were small and hard. "Well now, Cora," the sheriff began, his tone oozing false concern. "Glad to see you're settling your accounts. The territorial tax is still due, you know. And Mr. Deakins was just mentioning to me that your banknote is past its term." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping. "He's a reasonable man, though he's authorized me to tell you that he's willing to discuss a friendly solution, a private arrangement, if you're willing to cooperate." The implication was as thick and foul as the mud in a pigsty. Cooperate. Sell him the spring for pennies on the dollar, or perhaps offer something else entirely. The blood rushed to Cora's face, a hot tide of fury. She felt a tremor start in her hand, a telltale sign of the dehydration and stress she'd been fighting for weeks. She curled her fingers into a fist, hiding it in the folds of her skirt. She lifted her chin, her ash-blue eyes locking onto the sheriff's. "You tell Mr. Deakins," she said, her voice low and shaking with controlled anger. That I am not for sale. Not my land, not my water, and not my cooperation." The sheriff's smile vanished. His face hardened. "Have it your way, Vale. But when your cattle are bone dry and the bank forecloses, don't come crying to the law." He turned on his heel and strode away. A clear message delivered. The crowd began to disperse. Sensing the confrontation was over, Cora was left standing in the dust, her heart pounding, the weight of her choice settling upon her. She had won a small victory, but in doing so, she had declared war. Rowan Pike had stood silently through the exchange, his expression unchanging. Now, he held out the soft leather reins of salt cedar. Cora looked from the reins to his face, still uncertain of his motives. "He's your horse," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "No, ma'am," Rowan replied quietly. "He's yours. A horse belongs where it's trusted." His soot-stained fingers brushed against hers as she took the reins. The touch was brief, accidental, but a current of unexpected warmth passed between them. It was the first gesture of unconditional support she had received in a very long time. She looked into his steady, slate-gray eyes and saw not pity, but respect. For the first time that day, a sliver of hope, fragile as a spider's thread, began to form in the desolate landscape of her heart. She gave a short, stiff nod, unable to find the words to thank him. She turned and led her horse away from the square, away from the prying eyes and the whispers, heading back toward the lonely stretch of land that was both her burden and her birthright. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and purple, it cast long shadows from the peaks of Haymaker Ridge. The wind picked up again, carrying the scent of dry earth and the distant, mournful cry of a hawk. It was a lonely sound, but tonight it felt different. It no longer sounded like an ending. It sounded like the echo of a challenge, a promise of the long and difficult fight that had just begun. The 5-mile ride from Ashwin Station back to the Vale Ranch was a stretch of hardened silence. The only sounds were the plodding hooves of salt cedar on the packed earth and the constant, dry sigh of the wind. Rowan Pike led the horse, his stride long and steady, and Cora Vale walked beside him, her mind a turmoil of calculations. The money from the auction was a fraction of what she needed, and the $100 Rowan had paid for salt cedar felt less like a rescue and more like a loan she could never repay. When the faded red of her main barn, the Red Barn, as her father had always called it, came into view, she felt the familiar knot of solitary responsibility tighten in her gut. But today, it was different. Someone else was walking this path with her. Rowan didn't wait for an invitation. He led the stallion directly to the empty water trough by the barn wall, his gaze analytical. "Where's your wellhead?" "Behind the house," Cora said, her voice clipped. "The pump's been fighting me, sucking air." "I'll look at it," he said simply. He tied salt cedar to a post. "I'm a smith, but I understand pumps. I'll trade the work for a hot meal, if that's agreeable." Cora stared at him. The auction, the confrontation with Cutter, and now this, a straightforward offer. No insinuations, no veiled threats. Just work for food. It was the language of the frontier, a language she hadn't shared with anyone in a long time. "I have beans and cornbread," she said, her voice softening just a fraction. "That'll do fine." Rowan said, first, however, there was the horse. Inside the barn, the air was warm, smelling of old hay and leather. Salt Cedar was nervous, his white coat still damp with the sweat of his ordeal. Renshaw's man had been cruel with the rope, leaving a raw, weeping abrasion on the stallion's foreleg. "He needs tending," Cora said, retrieving her box of salves. "I'll hold him," Rowan offered. He didn't grab the bridle. He simply rested a large, soot-stained hand on the saddle horn area of the horse's back, his presence radiating a calm that seemed to flow directly into the animal. Salt Cedar, who would have kicked or bitten any other stranger, visibly relaxed, his ears softening. Cora knelt in the straw. She worked gently, cleaning the grit from the wound. "He trusts you," she murmured, more to herself than to Rowan. "He trusts quiet," Rowan replied. his voice a low rumble. He knows I'm not trying to take anything from him. As Cora reached for a clean strip of linen to wrap the wound, her fingers brushed the back of Rowan's hand, which still rested on the horse. His skin was calloused and warm. A jolt, quick and silent as a spark from his forge, shot up her arm. It was nothing and it was everything, a simple, accidental touch that felt more profound than any conversation. She pulled her hand back, her knuckles grazing the horse's hide, and focused on tying the knot. Rowan gave no sign he had noticed. His gaze fixed on the horse's mane, but the air in the stall had changed, thickening with an unspoken awareness. The kitchen was the only room in the small ranch house that still felt truly alive. A heavy wood-burning stove dominated one wall, its iron plates radiating a deep, penetrating warmth that fought back the evening chill. Cora moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice, ladling thick, dark beans onto 2 tin plates. They sat at the heavy pine table her father had built. The chairs were scarred, the wood grain worn smooth. For years, she had eaten every meal at this table alone. The presence of Rowan Pike, his solid frame filling the chair opposite her, felt strange, almost intrusive, yet deeply necessary. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the metallic scrape of spoons against tin. "This is good," Rowan said, gesturing to the beans. "Thank you. It's just beans," Cora replied, pushing her own around the plate. "A hot meal is never just beans," he said. He ate slowly, as if appreciating every bite. The silence stretched, but it wasn't the empty silence she was used to. It was watchful. "Why?" she finally asked, unable to hold the question back any longer. "The horse, the money. You don't know me." Rowan finished his mouthful before answering, "I know Deacons. And I know Renshaw, and I know men like that cowboy. I was cavalry, 4th Regiment, up in Wyoming territory." He paused, his eyes focused on something far beyond the kitchen wall. "I've seen what happens when men decide they have the right to take whatever they want, just because they're stronger. I saw a lot of blood spilled for land that didn't want to be owned. When I got out, I made a promise. I'd build things, fix things. I wouldn't be part of the breaking anymore." He looked at his calloused hands. "Today, in that square that was breaking." Cora absorbed this, a piece of his past, offered freely. She felt compelled to offer one of her own. "My father, he built this place. He understood the water. He always said the land gives you what you need, but it never gives you what you want." Her voice went flat. "He didn't make it through the big freeze in '88. Got caught in a whiteout trying to save a calf. It's just been me since then." She hadn't meant to say that last part. It sounded too much like self-pity, a luxury she couldn't afford. She stood, clearing her throat. "I need to check the ledger." She turned from the table to the map pinned to the wall. It was her father's pride, a detailed, hand-drawn chart of the Vale Ranch, with every dry wash, grazing meadow, and fence line marked in faded ink. In the very center, circled in blue, was the source of their life, Ghost Lantern Spring. But tonight, something was wrong. A thick, angry X had been slashed across the spring, drawn in a waxy red grease pencil. Cora's breath caught. She reached out, her finger tracing the mark. It was fresh. It smeared under her touch. "When did this happen?" Rowan was beside her, his voice low and serious. "It wasn't here this morning," she whispered, a cold dread washing over her. "I was in town all day, at the auction. Someone was here," Rowan said. "While you were gone, they were in your house." The violation felt as sharp as a physical blow. This mark wasn't just on a map. It was a brand, a claim. It was Deacons and Renshaw, telling her she was already finished. Rowan looked from the map to Cora's face, seeing the shock warring with the anger in her eyes. "Let's go fix that pump," he said, his voice hard. The moon was a cold silver disk, casting the ranch yard in a landscape of pale light and stark, black shadows. The pump mechanism was housed in a small stone shed, built directly over the spring source. The air here was cooler, carrying the faint, sweet smell of deep, clean water. Rowan lit a lantern. the yellow light flickering against the stone. He was a different man now. The quiet blacksmith was gone, replaced by the methodical ex-cavalryman. He examined the pump's iron flywheel, the piston, the seals. "You said it was sucking air," he said. "It's been getting weaker for weeks," Cora said, holding the lantern high. I thought the spring was failing." "The spring isn't failing?" Rowan pointed to the main intake pipe where it joined the piston housing. "This isn't wear. Cora, this is sabotage." He worked his fingers into the joint and pulled something out, a small, tightly wadded piece of leather. Deliberately jammed into the gasket to break the seal and let air in, but he wasn't finished. He ran his calloused thumb along the underside of the pipe itself, a place no one would think to look. He hissed, pulling his hand back. "Look at this." He held the lantern close. A thin, deep line had been filed into the metal, right at a stress point. They scored it, with a file or a heavy blade. It was meant to hold for a while, then crack under pressure. They didn't just want it to break. They wanted you to think it was failing on its own. Cora went still. The X on the map, the harassment at the auction, the slow, methodical murder of her water supply. This wasn't a run of bad luck. It was a siege. They weren't just waiting for her to fail. They were actively digging her grave. "They mean to bleed me dry," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "To make the spring worthless so I'll sell for nothing." "Not tonight," Rowan said. His voice was cold steel. He went to the small tool wagon he'd parked by the barn, the one he'd used to haul his anvil and forge to town. He returned with a heavy wrench, brazing equipment, and a short length of pipe. "This will be a temporary patch, but it'll hold." For the next 2 hours, they worked under the high moon. Rowan was a master of metal. He heated the pipe, the blue flame of his torch hissing, his face a mask of concentration, sweat beading on his forehead. Cora, following his clipped instructions, held the heavy tools in place, packed the new seals, and worked the hand bellows for his torch. They moved together, a team forged in the midnight crisis. Finally. Rowan stood back. "All right, try the handle." Cora put her weight on the heavy iron pump handle. Once, twice, on the third pull, it resisted. And then she heard it. Not the dry gasp of air, but a deep, liquid gurgle. A moment later, a stream of water, thin, but clear and steady, poured from the spout into the dry stone channel. But the channel itself, cracked from the drought and disuse, soaked up the water, letting only a trickle move forward. "It won't reach the cattle troughs," Cora said, her brief hope faltering. "Then we make it reach." Rowan said. He grabbed 2 shovels from the side of the shed. Under the cold gaze of the moon, they began to dig. The ground was hard as iron, and the work was brutal. They didn't try to repair the main channel. They dug a new narrow ditch, a shortcut, diverting the precious flow directly toward the large stone basin that served the cattle. The only sounds were the scrape of steel on packed earth and their own ragged breathing. The moonlight turned the sweat on their faces and necks to liquid silver. It was well past midnight when the first blessed trickle of water splashed into the bottom of the empty trough. Cora leaned on her shovel, her back screaming, her hands raw. Rowan stood beside her, his shirt plastered to his chest. Suddenly, Cora froze. She held up a hand. "Listen." Rowan stopped. His head tilting, he heard it, too. The slow, cautious beat of a single horse, moving just outside the main fence line. It wasn't one of her own. A light flared in the darkness, a lantern, held high. The beam swept across the ranch yard, a searching yellow eye. It passed over the house, the barn, and then found them. 2 figures frozen by the wellhead. The light held on them for a long, calculating second. Then it vanished. The hoofbeats, no longer cautious, exploded into a gallop, pounding away into the blackness. "A scout," Rowan said, his voice a low growl. "Renshaw's. Checking to see if the pump was truly dead." "And now he knows it isn't," Cora said, her voice hard. "He'll be back, to report that we're still here, still fighting. Go bar the barn. Rowan said, his tone shifting, becoming the cavalryman. Lock the house. They might come back tonight. I want to see what he left. Cora said. Her anger was a cold, sharp thing now. Before Rowan could protest, she was moving. She ran to the red barn, unbarred the door, and slipped inside. Salt Cedar, sensing her urgency, nickered. She didn't waste time with a saddle. She grabbed a fistful of his white mane, swung onto his bare back, and kicked him into a run, melting into the darkness. Rowan watched her go, a flash of white against the black, his heart hammering against his ribs. She was all grit and fire, and he knew in that moment that she was in more danger than she could possibly imagine. She was back in less than 10 minutes, sliding from the stallion's back, her chest heaving. He kept to the rocks, she panted. Smart, but I found where he lit the lantern, by the south gate, the ground soft there from a seep. She opened her hand to show the dark, damp earth clinging to her palm. He was careless. He left a perfect boot print, deep heel, with a new iron plate on the toe. She was shaking, not from fear, but from a cold, liberating rage. She finally had proof. They stood by the trough, watching the water rise. The horses, drawn by the sound, had gathered and were drinking, long and deep. Cora wiped her sweaty, muddy hands on her canvas trousers. Rowan was leaning against the fence, his own shirt soaked. He looked exhausted. She pulled the old bandana from her back pocket, a square of faded blue cotton, worn soft as flannel. It had been her father's. She held it out to him. You're covered in grime, she said, the practical words a thin cover for the tremor in her voice. Rowan looked at the small square of cloth, then at her. He took it. The bandana was warm from her body. He wiped his face, his neck, the black soot from the pump mixing with the dust of their digging. The gesture felt intensely personal, a small, shared intimacy in the cold night. When he was done, he didn't toss it aside. He folded it, slowly and carefully, into a neat square, and tucked it into his own shirt pocket, as if it were a keepsake. Thank you, Cora, he said. It was the first time he had used her name. The wind picked up, sighing through the eaves of the house. It was a lonely sound, one she knew well. It smelled of dry hay and dust, and it was heavy with the suffocating weight of all the years she had spent here, fighting this battle alone. You should go, Rowan, she said quietly. You heard him. You saw the pipe. This isn't your fight. They made it my fight when they scored that pipe, he said, his voice flat. I'll sleep in the hayloft. I want to be near the pump and the horses. Cora started to protest about propriety, about the danger, but the words died in her throat. She was too tired to argue. And, if she was honest, the thought of him being nearby, a solid, breathing presence in the red barn, was the first real comfort she had felt in years. She nodded. There are blankets in the tack room. She went inside the dark house. The kitchen was cold, the fire in the stove now just glowing embers. She lit a small oil lamp and sat at the table, pulling her father's heavy ledger toward her. For months, the entries had been bleak. No rain, feed prices up, sold 2 heifers. She dipped the pen in the inkwell. Her hand, though blistered and aching, was steady. She wrote the date beside it. She wrote, water flowed tonight, a little, but it flowed. It was a victory, small, dirty, and exhausting, but it was hers. Miles away, in a dark alley behind the Ashwind Station saloon, the same scout stood before Ephraim Deakins. The banker was cloaked in shadow, only the silver head of his walking stick catching the moonlight. The pump is running, sir, the scout reported, his voice nervous. I saw him. Her and that new blacksmith. They fixed the pipe. Deakins was silent for a full minute. The scout shuffled his feet, terrified of the quiet. Stubborn, Deakins said at last, his voice a soft, venomous hiss. Her father was stubborn too, and the winter took him. He adjusted the brim of his hat, a sharp, angry gesture. Renshaw will be displeased. It seems we must accelerate the schedule. Send word to Madigan. It is time for the next step. Mr. Madigan, sir, the scout asked, his voice wavering. Madigan was Renshaw's fixer, a man known for his brutal efficiency. Yes, Deacon said, stepping out of the shadow just enough to let the moonlight catch his cold eyes. A much louder step. If she insists on finding water, let's see how she handles fire. The day after the pump was fixed, the fight shifted from dirt to paper. The water in the trough was a tangible victory. A small act of defiance that Rowan's patched pipe pushed out with every rhythmic clank. But Cora knew it was a temporary fix. The true battle was not for the flow of water, but for the right to it. And that was a battle waged in ledgers and ink. She rode into Sagewind, the county seat, a larger, more imposing town than Ashwind Station. It was a town built on paper land claims, mining deeds, and banknotes. The county records office was a stern brick building that smelled of aging glue, dry dust, and the faint, sour aroma of bureaucracy. Behind a high counter sat Mr. Finchley, a man who seemed to have been pressed flat by the weight of the ledgers surrounding him. He had a thin neck, ink stains on his cuffs, and eyes that darted without ever seeming to make contact. "I am here to see the original survey maps and water rights filings for the Vale Ranch," Cora stated, her voice clear and firm in the quiet room. Mr. Finchley adjusted his spectacles. "The Vale holdings, yes, I believe we have those. That would fall under an archival search and retrieval protocol. And, of course, a duplication request, should you wish for copies." "I do," Cora said. "Very good." He produced a fee schedule, his finger landing on a line near the bottom. "Given the age of the documents and the historical significance," he added, with a slight, unctuous smile, "the retrieval and inspection fee will be $50, copies extra." Cora felt the blood drain from her face. $50. It was an impossible sum, more than she had made from the entire horse auction. It was theft, plain and simple, dressed up in a starched collar. That's extortionate. The territorial fee is $5. "Ah, but the county supervisor sets ancillary fees for complex retrievals," Finchley countered, his smile never wavering. He was enjoying this. He tapped his pen on the counter. "Cash, of course, in advance. Will you be paying today?" "Miss Vale." He knew she couldn't. This was Deakins' hand, as plain as the X on her map, a velvet glove closing her throat. "I see," Cora said, her voice dangerously quiet. She turned, her back rigid, and walked out into the harsh sunlight. The $50 demand echoing in her head, she didn't go back to the ranch. She went to the one place in Sagewind where she had an ally. Hart's Dressmaking Notions was a small shop tucked away on a side street, smelling of boat cloth, machine oil, and strong tea. Lydia Hart was the opposite of Mr. Finchley in every way. She was compact, energetic, and sharp as one of her own needles. A woman who had built a business from scratch by seeing what people needed and providing it, whether it was a new church dress or a sympathetic ear. She was Cora's oldest and only true friend in the territory. She took one look at Cora's face and pulled her into the back room, past the hanging muslin patterns. "Deakins," Lydia said. It wasn't a question. Cora explained the $50 fee. Lydia let out a low, unladylike whistle. "He's not even trying to hide it anymore. He's bought Finchley, body and soul. The man spends more at the saloon than his county salary could ever cover." Lydia poured 2 cups of tea, her movements quick and decisive. "You're not going to get those papers by asking Cora." "I know," Cora said, the frustration burning in her throat. "But without them, I have no proof. My father's deed just marks the land. It doesn't specify the spring's filing date against a competing claim." "Then you'll have to get them without asking." Lydia bustled over to a small, cluttered desk. She unlocked a drawer and took out a heavy ring of keys. She sorted through them, her brow furrowed, until she pulled one free. It was a long, iron skeleton key. "Old Finchley is vain," Lydia said, a wry smile playing on her lips. "He ordered a new suit for the territorial ball last month. He left his keys in his waistcoat pocket when he came for his fitting. I borrowed them, took an impression in a bar of soap. My brother-in-law in St. Louis is a locksmith. He made me a copy." "Lydia, why?" Cora stared at the key, her heart hammering. Because I knew this day was coming, Lydia said grimly. Deacons has been buying up land on all sides of you. He thinks no one is paying attention. This key opens the back door to the records office, and the smaller one on the ring. She indicated a small brass key. Opens the archive room itself. The real archive. Where they keep the original territorial surveys. She pressed the keys into Cora's hand. Don't use the front door. The lock is new. The back door hasn't been changed in 20 years. She glanced at the clock. Finchley leaves at 5. The night watchman doesn't come by until 10. That's your window. Be smart, Cora, and be quiet. While Cora was securing her alliance, Rowan Pike was forging one of his own. He wasn't a man for ledgers, but he was a man who listened. He'd spent the day in Ashwind Station, not at the bank, but at the Juniper Times, a one-room newspaper office above the Mercantile. The office was a chaotic temple of information. A massive printing press sat in the center like a black iron idol, and the air was thick with the metallic tang of ink and the sharp smell of lye. Jasper Quill, the editor, was a man in his late 50s, with ink-stained hands that matched Rowan's forge-stained ones. He wore a green eye shade and a look of permanent skepticism. Pike, Quill said, not looking up from his typesetting. Heard you bought a horse you didn't need. Stirred the pot. I'm here about the pot, Rowan said. Ephraim Deakins, Clint Renshaw, Cora Vale. What's the story you're not printing? Quill stopped working. He turned and finally looked at Rowan, his gaze sharp and assessing. That's a dangerous question to ask out loud. I've been in dangerous places before. Rowan said. Quill seemed to make a decision. He walked to a large map of the county pinned to his wall. Deakins isn't a rancher. He's a banker. He doesn't care about cattle. He cares about what cattle need. Water. Renshaw has the herds, but he's grazing on public land, and it's drying up. He needs a permanent water source, one that's private. He tapped the map, his finger landing on the precise location of the Vale Ranch. Right here. Ghost Lantern Spring. Rowan said, Exactly, but taking it outright is messy. Bad for business. Deakins prefers progress. Quill walked back to his desk and dug through a pile of flyers. He handed one to Rowan. It was an announcement for a public meeting. The Ashwind Station Community Dam Irrigation Project. Deakins is proposing the town form a trust, backed by his bank, to dam the upper fork of the Juniper Creek. Quill explained. He's selling it as a miracle. Water for everyone, prosperity, a new green valley. Rowan read the names of the trust's board members. Ephraim Deakins, Clint Renshaw, and Sheriff Boaz Cutter. Where does the Vale Ranch fit in? Rowan asked. It doesn't. Quill said, Look at the map. The proposed dam site is here, on the upper fork, but Ghost Lantern Spring is on the lower fork. The dam wouldn't touch it. So why is Deakins so desperate to get Cora Vale off her land before this is announced? Rowan saw it. The dam is a distraction, a land grab. It's worse, Quill said, his voice low. I've seen the preliminary surveys. This community dam is a phantom. It'll never get built. The ground's too porous. The water would sink before it ever reached a farmer's ditch. Deakins knows this. But the charter for the project, which he's already filed with the territorial legislature, includes a clause. It grants the trust paramount rights to all water sources in the Ashwind Basin to ensure the dam's success. If that charter is approved, Ghost Lantern Spring becomes his. Whether he builds the dam or not, he's not just trying to steal her spring. Pike, he's trying to do it legally. The pieces clicked into place. The sabotage, the auction, the pressure from Cutter. It was all a coordinated campaign to break Cora, to force her to sell her land before the charter was approved, allowing Deakins to acquire the spring privately and avoid public scrutiny. If she held on and the charter passed, he'd get it anyway. When is the charter vote? Rowan asked. Next month, when the circuit judge, Aurelia Stone, comes to Juniper Pass. She signs off on all new territorial charters. Quill spat into a brass spittoon. Deakins is counting on her just rubber stamping it, and he's counting on Cora Vale being long gone by then. The moon was a pale sliver, providing just enough light to turn the world a ghostly gray. At 9:30, the back alley of the Sagewind Records office was a pit of shadow. Cora, Rowan, and Lydia met at the corner. Lydia, practical as ever, had brought a crowbar. "Just in case the key is fussy," she whispered, but the key wasn't fussy. It turned in the old lock with a well-oiled, deeply satisfying click. The back door opened into a narrow hallway. The air was cold and dead. Rowan led the way, Cora behind him, Lydia guarding the rear. Lydia's brass key opened the archive room door, which groaned in protest. They froze. The sound was horribly loud, but no bells rang. No shouts were heard. They slipped inside and closed the door, plunging themselves into near total darkness. Rowan struck a match, the sudden flare making them all squint. He lit a small, shielded lantern, keeping the flame turned down low. The room was a canyon of paper. Floor-to-ceiling shelves were crammed with enormous, leather-bound volumes and long cardboard tubes containing maps. The Vale claim would be territorial era, pre-county, Lydia whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the tomb-like quiet. "Section C, Shelf 4. Rowan lifted the heavy volume. It was the original survey ledger. He and Cora carried it to a small desk in the corner. Cora's hands were shaking as she opened the cover. The pages were thick, the script elegant, cursive copperplate. She ran her finger down the index. "Vale, Henry, 1879. She turned to the page, and there it was, her father's signature, bold and strong, and the map, hand-drawn by the territorial surveyor, clearly marking the boundaries of the ranch. In the center, marked with the same blue ink she'd seen on her father's map, was the spring. The entry was dated October 14th, 1879. Water rights filed and approved. "We have it." Cora breathed, a wave of relief so strong it made her dizzy. "Wait," Rowan said, his voice tense. He had gone to the public access file cabinet, the one Finchley would have used. He pulled a different map, a more recent copy, and laid it on the desk next to the ledger. It was the same plot of land, but the map was different. This one was dated November 1st, 1880. It listed the land as belonging to the Renshaw Trust, and Ghost Lantern Spring was marked as a new discovery, filed by the trust. Her father's original 1879 claim was gone, as if it had never existed. This was the document Deakins and Renshaw would present as fact. "A forgery," Lydia whispered, horrified. "A good one," Rowan said, his eyes scanning the page, his cavalry training and observation taking over. "But not perfect." He pointed the lantern beam at the official county seal in the corner. "Look, on your father's 1879 map, the eagle's talon is sharp. On this 1880 map, it's blurred. The ink is pooled. They made a new stamp, but it's not an exact match." Cora was looking at the signature of the chief clerk. "That's not his signature." "It looks like it," Lydia said. "No," Cora insisted, her voice gaining strength. "Look at the S in his name. Stanton. On my father's map, it's a single, fluid stroke. On this one, it's drawn, not written. There's a slight hesitation at the top of the curve, like someone was tracing it." Rowan nodded, his respect for her sharp eyes growing. "They replaced the page. They took your father's original filing out of the public ledger and put this forgery in its place. But they were arrogant. They figured no one would ever know to check the original territorial volume." Thud, thud, thud. The sound came from the outer hallway. Heavy, measured footsteps, and the faint, metallic jingle of spurs. "Cutter," Cora whispered, her blood turning to ice. Rowan snuffed the lantern, plunging the room into absolute blackness. The footsteps stopped outside their door. A key rattled in the lock. "Behind the maps," Rowan hissed. He grabbed Cora's hand, pulling her, while Lydia scrambled for cover on her own. They slipped behind a tall, freestanding rack of rolled maps, pressing their backs against the dusty shelving. Cora and Rowan were crushed together, his chest hard against her side. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart against her arm. The door swung open. A beam of light from a powerful lantern sliced through the darkness, illuminating clouds of dust. Sheriff Boaz Cutter stood in the doorway, his large frame blocking the hall. He swept the lantern beam around the room. It passed over the desk, the open ledger, the discarded forged map. "Finchley, you damn fool," Cutter muttered to himself, leaving this mess out. His light beam moved slowly, methodically. It crept along the shelves, getting closer and closer to their hiding spot. Cora held her breath, her lungs burning. She was pressed so tightly against Rowan she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the faint, clean scent of soap in the iron of his forge. The beam of light hit the rack they were hiding behind. Lydia, from her spot across the aisle, made a tiny, desperate sound. A single brass pin, used for holding dress patterns, slipped from her trembling fingers and fell to the wooden floor. Tink. The sound was as loud as a gunshot in the silence. Cutter froze. The lantern beam snapped directly to the floor, illuminating the small, glinting piece of brass. He knew someone was in the room. Cora's heart stopped. She could feel Rowan beside her, absolutely, utterly still. He didn't breathe. He didn't move. He was a creature of iron and shadow. Cutter drew his pistol, the shing of the metal clearing the leather holster deafeningly loud. "All right," he boomed. "Yee. Come on out. I've got you." The beam of light moved from the pin, up the shelf, just inches from Lydia's hiding spot. Cora couldn't help it. A small, terrified tremor started in her back. She was going to be sick. Then she felt a pressure. Rowan's hand, his large, warm, calloused hand, settled gently but firmly on the small of her back. It wasn't a caress. It was an anchor. It was a silent, powerful command. "Still, be still. I am here." The warmth of his hand penetrated her clothes. Her fear, her shaking stopped. She took a tiny, silent breath and rooted herself to the spot, matching his stillness. Cutter's beam lingered. He was listening. The only sound was the scuttling of a mouse in the wall. He grunted. "Rats. Place is full of 'em." He clearly didn't believe it. He was tense. He took a step into the room, then another. He was checking behind the shelves. Suddenly, a loud shout echoed from the street outside. "Fire, fire at the livery," Cutter cursed. "Torn." He clearly suspected someone was in the archive, but a fire was a more immediate, public problem. He hesitated, his lantern beam sweeping the room one last, angry time. Then, with a growl of frustration, he holstered his pistol, backed out of the room, and slammed the door, locking it behind him. They waited, frozen, until the sound of his heavy boots faded down the hall and the front door of the building slammed shut. For a full minute, no one moved. Then Rowan let out a long, slow breath. His hand was still on Cora's back. He didn't seem to realize it, and she didn't want him to move it. "Lydia," Cora whispered, her voice hoarse. "I'm here." Lydia's voice trembled from the darkness. "My heart's near beat out of my chest." Rowan lit the lantern again, his own hand shaking slightly now that the danger was past. "That was too close. We have to go." "The papers," Cora said, her resolve returning. "We need copies." They couldn't take the ledger. Lydia produced a roll of thin wax paper and a charcoal pencil from her bag, working with frantic, precise speed. Cora and Lydia laid the paper over the 1879 ledger entry and the 1880 forgery, carefully tracing the maps, the signatures, and the all-important seals. Rowan stood guard at the door, listening. "It's done," Cora said, rolling the thin, fragile copies. "Where?" "My skirt," she said. She knelt and, using a small knife from her boot, quickly slit the stitches on the inside hem of her heavy canvas skirt. She slipped the rolled papers inside and pressed the hem flat. No gentleman would dare search it, and Cutter is no gentleman. They slipped out the back door, locking it behind them, and melted into the shadows of the alley. The shouts of fire had been a false alarm, already dying down a lucky, providential distraction. Lydia hugged Cora fiercely. "You be careful. This judge, I hope she's as good as they say." She squeezed Cora's arm, pressed the keys back into her hand, and disappeared into the night. Cora and Rowan were left alone on the deserted street. A hard frost was settling, and the boardwalks were slick and white under the pale moon. Their breath plumed in the cold air. Rowan started walking toward her wagon, which she'd left at the edge of town. He didn't ask. He just assumed he was walking with her. "You don't have to," Cora said, her voice quiet. "I'm used to walking back alone." "I know you are," Rowan said, not slowing down. He walked beside her, a solid, protective presence in the cold. The silence was companionable, filled with the adrenaline of their shared escape. They reached her wagon, tied near the dark shape of the Vale Ranch gate. The horses nickered softly. "Rowan," Cora said, turning to him, the hidden papers rustling faintly in her skirt. "The horse, the pump. Tonight. I hate being in debt." "Then don't be," he said, his voice gentle. He looked at her, his slate-gray eyes clear in the moonlight. "This isn't a debt, Cora. This is a partnership. Deakins and Renshaw. They're partners in greed. We're partners in, well, in this partnership." The word settled over her, a warmer and stronger garment than any shawl. She wasn't a burden to him. She was an ally. "So what's the plan, partner?" he asked. "Jasper Quill told you about Judge Aurelia Stone," Cora said, the idea solidifying in her mind. "She's due in Juniper Pass in 2 weeks to sign the new charters. She's the law, not Cutter's law, the real law. We're not going to wait for her to come here. We're going to go to her. We're going to show her these." She tapped the hem of her skirt. It was a dangerous, desperate plan, but it was the only one they had. Rowan nodded, a slow, grim smile touching his lips. "Juniper Pass, 2 weeks. We'd best get the wagon reinforced." He helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hand closing over hers for just a moment, a gesture of solidarity. He stepped back as she took the reins. The darkness of the night closed in around her as she drove through the gate. But it felt different now. It was no longer an empty, suffocating void. It was a blanket under which a plan was growing. Back in the red barn, Salt Cedar, safe in his stall, turned his head toward the sound of the approaching wagon. The sliver of moonlight from the high window caught his large, dark eye, and for a fleeting second, it reflected a single, brilliant point of light, a small, sharp, and stubborn hope. The false dawn was a smear of cold, bruised gray. It was not the light that woke Rowan, but the smell. He was in the red barn hayloft, a position he'd taken as a permanent watch, and his sleep was light. The scent that cut through the familiar notes of hay and leather was the sharp, metallic tang of kerosene. He was moving before he was fully awake, dropping from the loft to the packed earth floor in a single, silent motion. "Cora, fire!" He burst through the barn doors just as Cora, roused by the sound of her own name, ran from the house, pulling on her boots, her hair unbraided and wild. They stopped, frozen for one heart-stopping second by the scene before them. The entire south pasture fence, a line of barbed wire and cedar posts, was cut. The wires hung in slack, curling tendrils, and the massive hayricks they had spent all the fall stacking against the coming winter were a wall of roaring flame, the kerosene-soaked bales exploding into the pre-dawn dark. "The cattle," Cora breathed, her voice a gasp of pure horror. The herd, trapped between the inferno at their backs and the open, unknown darkness of the flats before them, was a low, moaning mass of terror. Then the men appeared, 3 riders, silhouetted against the fire. "It's Madigan." Rowan's voice was flat, hard steel. Luke Madigan, Renshaw's fixer, and his 2 men fired their pistols into the air. The sound, combined with the whoops and yells, was the final push. The herd's terror broke. It was a single, violent decision. The cattle turned as one, a thundering tide of horn and panic, and poured through the cut fence, stampeding toward the open, waterless desolation of the flats. This wasn't just vandalism. It was a roundup. It was theft on a grand scale. "They're driving them off the ranch," Cora yelled, her terror instantly forged into a white-hot rage. She sprinted back to the barn, Rowan at her heels. There was no time for finesse. They threw saddles onto the two closest horses Salt Cedar for her, a sturdy bay gelding for him, and cinched them with raw, desperate strength. They were mounted and riding in under a minute, charging into the chaos. The world dissolved into a nightmare of dust and noise. The air was so thick with grit that it was impossible to breathe, a choking, palpable fog that stung the eyes and coated the tongue. The ground trembled under the assault of 1,000 hooves, a continuous, deafening roar that vibrated up through the horses and into the riders' bones. Cora, born to this, reacted on instinct. She pushed Salt Cedar hard, her legs gripping his sides, trying to get ahead of the lead steer, an old, long-horned brindle that was running blind with panic. If she could turn the leader, she could turn the herd. She uncoiled her lariat, the rope singing as it cut the air, trying to get a purchase. But the cattle were too tightly packed. Rowan, the ex-cavalryman, rode differently. He didn't try to lead. He attacked the flank. He drove his horse into the side of the herd like a wedge, using his mount's weight and his own solid presence to break the herd's momentum, to sow just enough confusion to slow the animals down. A rider, one of Madigan's, saw him and charged, his own rope swinging. Rowan didn't flinch. He rode directly at the man, forcing him to veer off at the last second, his horse rearing as it nearly collided with a panicked steer. They were fighting a losing battle, 2 people against a tide. When Cora saw the new disaster, "The wagon!" she screamed. In their haste, Madigan's men had been thorough. The ranch's heavy water wagon, the only way Cora had to move water to the distant pastures, had been unhitched. Its wooden chocks were kicked away. It was sitting at the top of a long, gentle slope that led down to the dry, rocky creek bed, and it was moving. Slowly at first, then faster, the massive wheels groaning, the heavy barrel picking up momentum. If it hit the rocks in the creek bed, it would shatter, an irreplaceable loss. Rowan saw it. He didn't hesitate. He wheeled his horse, abandoning the herd, and galloped toward the rolling wagon. He rode past it, then leaped from the saddle. He hit the ground running, his cavalry training evident in the fluid. Controlled fall. He looked around, desperate, for something to use as a brake. He spotted a heavy split rail from a broken fence line. He grabbed the piece of wood, ran alongside the lumbering wagon as the wheel spun faster, and with a guttural roar, jammed the thick post into the spokes. The sound was a sickening crack of splintering oak. The wheel locked, the wagon skidded, and the wooden rail exploded, the force of the stop driving splinters and shards into Rowan's hands. He cried out, pulling his hands back, blood welling from a dozen small cuts. But the wagon was stopped, perched precariously on the slope. His heroic act had cost them. In those few seconds, Cora had been left alone. A single rider trying to turn a stampede. Madigan, seeing his chance, signaled to his last man. The rider swung his rope, not at Cora, but at the ground in front of Salt Cedar. The horse, already on edge, saw the snake-like rope and reared violently. Cora, an expert rider, stayed with him, but the sudden, vertical motion snapped her lariat, which had snagged on a passing steer. Taut, the rope was ripped from her grasp with such force that it pulled her clean from the saddle. She landed hard on her back, the air exploding from her lungs. She was on the ground, directly in the path of the trailing edge of the stampede. She saw a world of dust, rolling eyes, and flashing hooves. She tried to roll, but her body wouldn't obey. "Cora!" Rowan's voice. He was running, his boots pounding the hard earth. He didn't slow down. He dove, tackling her around the waist, his body shielding hers. They rolled once, twice, a tangle of limbs, into a shallow ditch of dry, brittle grass as a dozen terrified steers thundered over the exact spot where she had fallen. They lay there, gasping, their hearts hammering against each other. Cora was coughing, her lungs full of dust, her body bruised but whole. Rowan was breathing hard, his arms still locked around her, his face buried for a second in her hair. "Are you hurt?" he panted. his voice ragged. "No," she managed to say. "You—" He just shook his head, pushing himself up on one elbow, his bloody hands leaving red prints on the dusty earth. The sound of the stampede was fading. Madigan and his men had succeeded. The bulk of the herd was gone. A new sound cut through the air. A single sharp rifle shot that was entirely different from the chaotic pistol fire. It wasn't a warning. It was a statement. Madigan, who had been sitting on his horse watching the scene with a satisfied smirk, suddenly stiffened. A puff of dust kicked up just in front of his horse's hooves. He looked up, his eyes scanning the low ridge that overlooked the pasture. A figure was sitting on a painted pony, still as the rocks around him. He hadn't been there a moment ago. He seemed to have materialized from the gray morning light. He wore buckskins and his black hair was in 2 long braids. "Thomas," Cora breathed, a wave of profound relief washing over her. Thomas Redleaf, a Ute scout, was not given to grand entrances. He was a man of the earth, and he and Cora had a long-standing, quiet friendship, born of a mutual agreement to share the salt grass flats on their border. He'd seen the smoke from his own camp 2 miles away. Madigan and his men regrouped, staring up at the lone rider. They had the herd, but now they had a witness, and a skilled one at that. Cora and Rowan got to their feet, bruised and aching. The fight was over. Now, the cleanup. "The fire," Rowan said, his voice grim. They ran back to the smoldering hayricks. The horses, Salt Cedar included, had scattered but were now returning, drawn by their owners. Thomas rode down from the ridge, his pony moving with a fluid, silent grace. He dismounted and walked not to Cora, but to the patch of ground where Madigan had been sitting on his horse. He knelt. "He was here," Thomas said, his voice quiet. He pointed. In the soft earth, churned by the cattle, was one perfect, clear boot print. It was deep in the heel, with the distinct, sharp outline of an iron plate reinforcing the toe. "The same print," Cora whispered, remembering the mark by her fence. "The man who watched the pump, Luke Madigan," Thomas affirmed. He looked at Rowan's bleeding hands. "You should wrap those." They worked as a team. Rowan and Cora used wet tarps from the wagon to beat out the last of the flames. A grueling, smoky task that left them coughing, their eyes streaming. The smell of burned hay, acrid and heartbreaking, filled the air. Cora's shirt was plastered to her back with sweat and streaked with black ash. As she finally stood upright, a wave of exhaustion and loss hitting her, Rowan pulled his canvas duster from his saddle roll. He draped it over her shoulders. The gesture was simple, practical, a shield against the morning chill and the sting of their defeat. Madigan, watching from a safe distance, was furious. His plan to run the herd and remain unseen had been foiled. He was exposed. He raised his rifle, aiming not at a person, but at the water wagon Rowan had saved. It was an act of pure spite. He never fired. A second shot rang out from Thomas's rifle. It was not a warning. It was a precise, surgical strike. A high-pitched clang echoed across the flats. Madigan cried out, his rifle jumping from his hands as if struck by a snake. Thomas had hit the barrel, splitting the steel and rendering the weapon useless. Madigan stared at his ruined rifle, then at the still figure of the Ute scout. He was outmatched. Spitting a curse, he signaled to his men, and the 3 riders vanished into the hills, driving the stolen cattle before them. Just as the last of them disappeared, a new sound was heard: a wagon, rattling hard and fast. It was Lydia Hart, driving her sturdy buckboard, with Jasper Quill beside her, clutching a large, strange-looking wooden box. "We saw the smoke," Lydia called out, pulling the horse to a stop. "We figured it was Deakins' next move." Jasper didn't waste words. He hauled the box from the wagon. It was a camera, a heavy, wet-plate collodion field camera, complete with a tripod and a dark cloth. "The judge won't just listen," Jasper said, his eyes burning with a reporter's zeal. "She will see." While Lydia, seeing Rowan's hands, immediately began cleaning and bandaging them with strips of clean cloth from her bag. Jasper went to work. He photographed the burned ricks. He photographed the cut fence wires. He photographed the deep tracks of the water wagon, and, most importantly, he set up his tripod and meticulously photographed the iron-tipped boot print that Tomas stood guard over. "This," Jasper said, sliding the glass plate into its light-proof box, "is the link, sabotage and armed assault. This is our case." They were so focused on the evidence that none of them heard the last rider approach until he was almost upon them. "Quite a mess you've made here. Vale." Sheriff Boaz Cutter sat on his horse, his hands resting on his saddle horn, his eyes taking in the scene with a cold, dismissive air. He had arrived, as always, after the danger was past. "They drove off half my herd." "Sheriff," Cora said, stepping forward, Rowan's duster still around her shoulders. "Luke Madigan and his men. They cut my fence and set fire to my hay." Cutter sighed, a sound of profound boredom. "Now, Cora, that's a serious accusation. Luke Madigan works for Mr. Renshaw, a respectable man. Sounds to me like a grass fire got out of hand and your cattle got spooked. It happens." "I saw him," Rowan said, stepping up beside Cora, his bandaged hands held stiffly at his sides. "And you are?" Cutter's gaze was venomous. "Oh, yes, the blacksmith. The one who's been causing all this trouble? Bidding at auctions, trespassing." He pointed a thick finger at Rowan. "Seems to me you're the common denominator here. Pike, I ought to arrest you right now for disturbing the peace. Maybe inciting a riot." Cutter reached for his handcuffs. "You will not!" Cora's voice was not loud, but it cut through the morning air like a razor. She stepped directly in front of Rowan, planting herself between him and the sheriff. Her face was black with soot, her hair a wild tangle, but her eyes were the color of cold steel. "You aren't touching him," she said. "And you aren't welcome on this ranch. We know you work for Deakins. We know about the forged map in the county office." Cutter's smile faltered. His eyes went flat. "We have copies of the original 1879 filing," Cora continued, her voice gaining strength as she saw his reaction. "And we have photographs of this." She pointed to the boot print. "We are bringing all of it to Judge Aurelia Stone in Juniper Pass. Now, you can either arrest us all as witnesses, Sheriff, or you can get off my land." Cutter stared at her. The equation had changed. This wasn't a hysterical woman he could bully. This was a plaintiff with evidence. He looked at Rowan, at the Ute scout, at the newspaper editor with his camera. He was outnumbered. He pulled his horse's head around, his face a mask of cold fury. "You're playing a dangerous game. Cora, you and your friends. You may not make it to Juniper Pass." He kicked his horse and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. That night, the 5 of them gathered in the red barn. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and a new, sharp tension. The remaining cattle were restless in the corral. Lydia was packing a crate with dried food and medical supplies. Jasper was carefully boxing his glass plates. Thomas was sharpening a long knife. Rowan was checking the axles on Cora's wagon, his bandaged hands moving with deliberate care. "He was threatening us," Lydia said, her voice tight. "Cutter, he was threatening to stop us from reaching the judge." "He will try," Tomas said quietly, testing the blade with his thumb. "The road to Juniper Pass is lonely, easy for a wagon to have an accident." "Then we don't have an accident," Rowan said, hammering a new iron brace onto the wagon's undercarriage. "We reinforce this wagon, we arm ourselves, and we leave before they expect us to." Cora stood at the barn door, looking out at what was left of her ranch. The burned hay was a black scar on the land. Half her herd was gone, but the pump was still clanking, pushing water into the trough. The house was standing, and her friends were with her. "We hold this land," she said, turning to them, her voice finding its strength. "We keep the spring flowing. We get this evidence to the judge. We're done being a target. From now on, we're the hunters." High in the rafters, the pigeons that had returned after the fire cooed nervously. Suddenly, a gust of wind, a precursor to a changing weather front, slammed the Hayloft door. The birds exploded from the rafters in a clatter of wings. bursting out of the barn window as if fleeing a ghost. Tomas looked up at the empty, smoke-stained beams. "The air is unsettled," he said. "Another storm is coming." The storm Tomas had predicted did not arrive gently. It came just after midnight, an unseasonable deluge that broke the drought with a vengeance. Lydia, Jasper, and Thomas had long since departed to their respective homes, agreeing to meet back at the ranch in 2 days, giving the roads time to dry before the hard ride to Juniper Pass. Cora and Rowan were left alone. Having just finished the last reinforcement on the wagon axle, they stood in the wide-open main door of the red barn, watching the sky tear open. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid silver sheets that hammered the parched earth, instantly turning the ranch yard into a churning sea of mud. Thunder cannonaded off Haymaker Ridge, and the wind howled, a physical blow that drove the cold rain deep into the barn. "We can't do any more tonight," Rowan yelled over the roar. He shoved the heavy barn door, and Cora threw her weight against the other side. They managed to bar it just as a violent gust threatened to rip it from its hinges. They were suddenly plunged into a different world. The roar of the storm was muffled, replaced by the deafening, drumming tattoo of rain on the shingled roof. They were soaked. Water ran in rivulets from Rowan's hair and dripped from Cora's braid. The single storm lantern hanging from a beam was their only light, casting huge, dancing shadows. "So much for the roads drying out," Cora said, her voice sounding small in the vast, noisy darkness. She shivered, pushing the wet hair from her face. Her shirt was plastered to her back and shoulders, the cold seeping into her bones. "We'll be delayed, that's all," Rowan said. He looked at her, his expression practical, but his eyes were dark with a concern that went beyond the weather. "You're freezing. You need to get dry." "We both do." The main floor of the barn was damp, the wind driving spray through every crack. The only truly dry place was the hayloft. "Up," Rowan said, gesturing with the lantern. "It'll be warmer." He climbed the ladder first, his wet boots thudding on the rungs. He placed the lantern on a low beam, its yellow light immediately bathing the loft in a soft, warm glow. The space was high and sheltered, the scent of the new hay, sweet and rich, mixing with the smell of the rain and the ozone from the lightning. The sound of the storm was softer up here, a constant, rhythmic drumming on the roof just above their heads. Cora followed. When she reached the top, her foot slipped on the last rung, slick with mud. Rowan's hand shot out, his grip strong and steady on her forearm, easily lifting her the last few inches onto the straw-covered floor. His touch was impersonal, a simple act of assistance, but it sent a jolt of heat through her cold skin. "Thank you," she murmured, pulling away. The loft was their refuge. They stood awkwardly for a moment, two soaked figures in a small pool of light, surrounded by the storm. "We need to get these wet things off," Cora said, her voice practical, though her heart gave a nervous kick. She unbuckled the wide, heavy leather belt at her waist, the one that held her canteen and a small knife. She hung it from a peg on the wall. Her heavy canvas overshirt, the one Rowan had draped over her during the fire, was saturated. She unbuttoned it, her fingers clumsy and cold, and hung it beside the belt. She was left in her simple cotton work blouse and heavy skirt, but the rain had been driven by the wind, and her clothes were soaked through. The damp fabric of her skirt clung to her legs, and where she'd kneeled in the mud to brace the wagon, a dark streak curved from her knee to her thigh. She kicked off her heavy, waterlogged boots and peeled off her wet stockings, her bare feet sinking into the soft, clean straw. The straw pricked at her skin, but it was dry. Rowan, with his back turned to give her privacy, did the same, shedding his heavy soaked duster and his outer shirt. He hung them on a separate post. He was left in his undershirt and trousers, the damp fabric outlining the broad muscles of his shoulders and back, sculpted by years at the forge. The air in the loft was warmer than below, heavy with their shared body heat and the earthy scent of the hay, now overlaid with the clean, sharp smell of wet cotton and the faint, metallic tang of the storm. Rowan turned, his gaze careful. He saw her standing there, small and barefoot, her shoulders hunched against a shiver. Without a word, he grabbed a heavy, clean horse blanket from a nearby stack one kept for foaling and shook it out. He didn't approach her. He simply laid it over a large, well-packed bale of hay, creating a dry, insulated seat. "Sit," he said, "before you catch your death." She obeyed, sinking onto the blanket. The wool was rough but warm. Rowan sat a respectable few feet away, on the edge of the bale, his back against a support post, his forearms resting on his knees. His bandaged hands, the ones Lydia had wrapped, were stark white against the darkness of his wet trousers. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the storm. It was the first moment of stillness either of them had known in days. The fight for the ranch, the stampede, the discovery in the archives, it all seemed to be swirling outside, held at bay by the rain and the thin wooden walls of the loft. Here, there was only the sound of the rain and their breathing. Cora looked at his hands. "Do they hurt?" she asked, her voice low. Rowan flexed his fingers. "They've been worse. You saved the wagon. You saved me. From the herd." It was a reaction. "Cora, not a plan." "It's always your reaction, isn't it?" she said, the words coming out softer than she intended. "To build, to fix, to shield." She shifted on the blanket, moving closer. The straw rustled under her. He didn't pull away, but she could feel him tense, his stillness becoming a conscious effort. She reached out, her fingers hesitant, and lightly touched the back of his bandaged hand. Even through the linen, she could feel the hard, calloused reality of him. "These hands," she whispered, her voice thick. "They held a crazed herd, and they held me. They kept me from being trampled." Rowan turned his hand over, but he didn't clasp hers. He simply let his palm rest near her fingers, an offering, not a demand. "They're just hands. Cora, they do what's needed." "No," she said. She looked from his hand to his face. The lantern light carved deep shadows under his cheekbones and lit a low, steady fire in his slate-gray eyes. He was watching her with a painful, controlled intensity. A man holding his breath, determined to respect the lines she had drawn around herself. She saw his respect, and, in that moment, she realized she was tired of those lines. She was tired of being the lonely rancher, the solitary fighter. She made the decision. She leaned forward, closing the small, cold space between them. He didn't move, a statue of iron and respect. She didn't try to kiss him. Instead, she lowered her head and gently, tentatively, rested her forehead against the side of his neck, just below his jaw. His skin was warm, and it smelled of soap and forge smoke and the clean scent of the rain. He was so incredibly solid. She felt the slight, rough scrape of his evening beard against her brow. She closed her eyes, letting out a breath she felt she'd been holding since her father died. It was a shuddering sigh of pure, unadulterated exhaustion and relief. Her breath, hot and moist, ghosted across his skin. She felt the answering tremor that ran through him, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath. His entire body went rigid. He was fighting himself, fighting his instinct to pull her closer, still giving her the chance to retreat. But Cora didn't want to retreat. "Rowan," she whispered, her lips barely moving, the sound of vibration against his throat. She felt his hand, his uninjured one. "Come up." It hovered in the air beside her face for a long second. His fingers spread, before he finally, slowly, rested it on her shoulder. His touch was a question. She needed to be closer, to close the last few inches of cold air. She shifted on the bale, her damp skirt pulling at her knees. She drew the heavy fabric up just slightly, just enough to get her footing in the shifting straw, enough to let her brace her knees against the hay bale, a movement that brought them lightly, brushing against his hip. It was a small, practical adjustment that was, at the same time, the most intimate gesture she had ever made. She was no longer leaning on him. She was with him, tucked against his side, her head resting on his shoulder, her knees nested near his. The warmth from his body was a profound comfort. He still held himself in check, his hand a heavy, warm weight on her shoulder, his breathing tight. "Cora," he said, his voice a low rasp. He wasn't warning her. He was warning himself. "It's all right," she whispered. She tilted her head, looking up. Her face was only inches from his. The lantern light caught the lingering moisture on her eyelashes. He looked down at her. He saw the weariness in her eyes. But underneath it, he saw the same ironclad will that had faced down Sheriff Cutter. And he saw something new, something softer, that was aimed only at him. It was a clear and unambiguous permission. He stopped, a breath away, his gaze searching hers, making the final, silent query. "Are you sure?" Cora gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the answer he needed. She lifted her own hands, resting them on his shoulders. Then, emboldened, she slid one hand up, her fingers threading into the damp, thick hair at the nape of his neck, and gently, firmly, pulled him down. He met her halfway. It was not a kiss of frantic possession or desperate need. It was a kiss of profound arrival. It was the end of a long, cold, lonely road. His lips were warm and firm, and he tasted of the storm, of rain and a faint, smoky flavor that was just him. At first, it was just a gentle, pressing contact, a mutual acknowledgement, a question and an answer in one. His hand, the one on her shoulder, slid up, his calloused thumb brushing the line of her jaw, his touch impossibly tender for a man who hammered steel. Cora's own hands, no longer trembling, held him fast, her fingers gripping the solid muscle of his shoulders. She leaned into him, the long, straight line of her back finally yielding, pressing against the solid wall of his chest. The kiss deepened, a slow, warm exploration. It was a promise, a comfort, a fire in the cold. It was the sealing of the partnership he had named. His other hand, the bandaged one, came to rest on her waist, his touch careful but possessive, holding her steady as she pressed closer. They shifted, their bodies aligning, shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, a perfect fit in the straw-scented darkness. The storm roared outside, a counterpoint to the quiet, profound thunder in their chests. The lantern light flickered, casting their joined shadows against the high wooden beams, making them a single, unified shape. They breathed each other in when they finally broke apart. It wasn't a separation, but a pause. They rested their foreheads together. Cora was smiling, a small, breathless smile that was more a release of tension than a sign of joy. Rowan mirrored it, a slight upward quirk of his lips, his eyes still closed. They were breathed smiles, shared in the small, warm space between them. "I hate owing people," Cora whispered again, her voice thick. "I don't know how to repay what you've done. The horse, the pump, my life. Stop trying to repay me," Rowan murmured, his lips brushing her temple. "This isn't a ledger. Cora." "I know," she said. She pulled back just enough to meet his gaze. The fire in his eyes was steady now, and it was full of a warmth that was entirely for her. "I don't need promises on paper. I've seen what Deacons does with those." She took a breath. "I just need you to stand by me when I need it." "I'm standing here," Rowan said, his voice a low vow. "And I will continue to—" He cupped her face, his gaze unwavering. "When this is done, when the spring is safe, we will talk about what comes after." It was a promise of a future she hadn't dared to dream of. A chill gust of wind found a crack in the loft, and Cora shivered. Rowan, ever practical, ever protective, released her. He reached for the thick horse blanket they were sitting on and drew the heavy end of it up, draping it over her shoulders, tucking it around her like a shield. It was an act of profound, respectful care. He kept his arm around her, and she leaned her head on his shoulder, her body finally relaxing, surrendering to the exhaustion and the feeling of absolute safety. Outside, the first furious onslaught of the storm began to pass. The drumming on the roof softened, easing into a steady, rhythmic rain. The thunder was a distant rumble, moving east. In the warm, dry hayloft, wrapped in a wool blanket and the solid strength of Rowan's arm. Cora Vale closed her eyes. The straw was warm, and it held the familiar, comforting scent of the earth, of her home. But now, it was mingled with a new scent, one of iron and soap and quiet strength. It was the beginning of something she couldn't yet name, but for the first time in her life, she was not alone to face the dawn. The storm broke as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving the world scoured and sodden. The 2 days Cora and her allies were forced to wait for the roads to Juniper Pass to become passable were a gift of time to their enemies. The moment the telegraph lines were repaired, Ephraim Deakins, now in a state of controlled panic, began his counterattack. He didn't use guns. He used whispers, a currency more potent and harder to trace. The rumor started in the Ashwind Station saloon and spread through the county like cholera. It was carried by Renshaw's men, by merchants on Deacon's payroll, and by ranchers who simply envied the Vale land. "Did you hear?" one man would say to another over a warm beer. "Cora Vale's finally come to her senses. Selling Ghost Lantern Spring to the Renshaw Trust. Heard she got a fine price for it, too. Smart girl. Finally admitted a woman can't hold a ranch like that alone." The poison was threefold. It painted Cora as a failure who had given up. It established the Renshaw Trust as the legitimate new owner in the public's mind. And it preemptively branded Cora a liar if she later tried to claim the spring was stolen. It was a move designed to poison any potential jury pool, to make Judge Stone's arrival a mere formality. But Deakins had underestimated Jasper Quill. The Juniper Times hit the streets of Ashwind Station and Sagewind 48 hours later. The ink was still wet, and the headline was a single, explosive line of type, "The bank's crooked seal." Jasper had not published the tracings that was evidence for the court. Instead, he published a meticulous, side-by-side description of the two documents. On the left, he described the 1879 territorial ledger, with Henry Vale's signature and the clear, sharp county seal. On the right, he described the 1880 public copy that named the Renshaw Trust, detailing the hesitant, drawn signature of the clerk and, most damningly, the blurred, imperfect eagle's talon on the forged seal. Jasper's article didn't accuse Deakins of forgery. It simply asked the questions. Why does the Ashwind Station Bank's official copy of the water rights not match the original territorial survey in the Sagewind archive? Why would the Renshaw Trust file a claim on a spring that was already legally deeded a year prior, and why, he concluded, is Mr. Deakins's community dam project charter so dependent on a spring he does not, according to the archives, legally own? The town exploded. The whispers about Cora selling out were instantly suffocated by a roar of speculation about Deakins stealing. The battle lines, once invisible, were now drawn through the center of town. Deakins, trapped and furious, made his next move. The article had confirmed his worst fear. Cora had the original maps. He had to get them, not just to save his charter, but to save himself from a federal fraud investigation. He turned to the only weapon he had left that wore a badge. He sent Sheriff Cutter. Cora, Rowan, Lydia, and Jasper were in the Vale Ranch yard, loading the last of the reinforced axle fittings onto the wagon, when Cutter and 2 deputies rode in. Thomas was not visible, having already melted into the ridges to act as a scout for their journey. "Hold right there!" Cutter boomed. Dismounting, he held up a piece of paper, waving it like a threat. "I have a warrant to search these premises." Cora stepped forward, her hand instinctively going to the small knife on her belt. "On what grounds, Sheriff?" "On the grounds of theft of county property." Cutter sneered. "Mr. Finchley from the records office has filed a complaint. Claims you and your associates broke into his office and stole official territorial documents. I'm here to retrieve them." Rowan moved to stand beside Cora, his bandaged hands held loosely at his sides. "You're not searching anything." "I have a warrant." "Pike, you interfere. I'll arrest you for obstruction." "Let me see that." It was Lydia who spoke. She stepped past Cora, her hands on her hips, her small, 5-foot frame radiating an authority that Cutter had not anticipated. She was a townswoman. She understood paper. Cutter, surprised by her audacity, shoved the warrant at her. Lydia took it. Her eyes the sharp, practiced eyes of a seamstress who can spot a flawed stitch at 10 paces scanned the document. She read it once. Then she read it again. A small, tight smile touched her lips. "This is very impressive, Sheriff," she said, her voice dripping with mock admiration. "A writ of retrieval for stolen documents. Very official sounding." She looked up, her smile vanishing. "But it's not a search warrant, and it's not signed by Judge Aurelia Stone, or any circuit judge for that matter. It's signed by, well, fancy that. It's signed by you." Cutter's face turned a dull, mottled red. "This isn't a legal document, Sheriff," Lydia continued, her voice rising, clear and sharp. "This is a piece of paper you wrote yourself, authorizing yourself to rummage through a private citizen's belongings. It's toilet paper with a fancy heading. You are not setting one foot in that house." She had legally disarmed him in front of his own deputies. Cutter was speechless, his hand hovering near the grip of his pistol, but he knew he'd been caught. To proceed now would be an act of open, illegal aggression, and with Jasper Quill standing right there, pen and paper in hand, it was a risk even he wouldn't take. "You're all obstructing justice," he finally snarled, ripping the useless paper from her hand. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Cora said, her voice low. "Get off my land." Cutter mounted his horse, his eyes promising a violence his warrant couldn't deliver. He and his deputies rode off, but as Rowan watched them go, he noted, one of them split off. "He's heading for the ridge. Cutter's leaving us a watchdog." They had won the confrontation, but the tension was now a high-strung wire. They hurried their preparations, their eyes constantly straying to the lone figure on the ridge, a small black dot against the sky. An hour later, Thomas Redleaf appeared at the barn door as silently as a shadow. He had circled the ridge, unseen. "The deputy on the hill is not the threat," Thomas said, his voice flat. "He is only the eyes. The threat is in town. Luke Madigan." Cora froze, a crate of ammunition in her hands. "Madigan is at the saloon." Thomas continued. "He is not with his usual crew. He has 3 new men with him. I know one. He runs with a crowd from Dry Lantern Creek. They are not cowboys. They are gunslingers, hired for a fight. They will come tonight. The man on the ridge will watch them do it, and he will report that he saw nothing." "They're not coming for the cattle this time," Rowan said, his voice grim. "Jasper's article forced Deacon's hand. They're coming for the maps. They're coming to silence us." The ranch, once a home, was now a fortress. As dusk settled, a cold, heavy dread fell with it. They gathered in the red barn, the lantern light casting long, fearful shadows. Cora took charge. "They know we're here. They know we're planning to leave for Juniper Pass. They have to stop us tonight. They'll expect the evidence to be in the house, or in Jasper's camera box." She looked at her friends. "Lydia, Jasper, you stay in the house. Bar the doors. Shutter the windows. Keep the glass plates and the camera box with you. They'll hear you. You're the decoy. They have to believe the proof is with you." Lydia nodded, her face pale but set. Jasper gripped his camera box like a shield. "Rowan, Thomas," Cora went on. "They'll hit the barn. They'll be looking for the tracings, or for us. I want you both in the hayloft, high ground, and a good field of fire on the house and the yard. If they break into the house, you stop them." "And you?" Rowan asked, his voice tight. He hated this, hated splitting up. "They'll expect me to be in the house, hiding under the bed," Cora said, a cold smile touching her lips. "I won't be. I'll be at the wellhead, the stone pump house. It's dark, it's solid, and I can see the yard, the barn, and the house. I will be their blind spot." Midnight. The ranch was dead silent. The deputy on the ridge was a motionless statue. The moon was obscured by a high, thin layer of clouds. Then they came. Cora, crouched in the stone pump house, saw them first. 3 shadows, detaching themselves from the deeper blackness of the fence line. They moved with a predatory grace. They split up exactly as she had predicted. One man went to the house, prying at a back window. The other two, including a large man she recognized as Luke Madigan, slid open the main door of the red barn. In the house, Lydia and Jasper heard the scrape of a knife at the window latch. They held their breath, clutching the heavy, empty camera box, their hearts pounding in unison. In the barn, Madigan and his man stepped inside. It was pitch black. "Fools are in the house," Madigan whispered. He struck a match and lit a shielded lantern. "Find the maps. Check the wagon. Then we'll go join the fun." The man moved toward the wagon. Madigan held the lantern high, in the loft above. Rowan held his breath, his heavy forged tongs in his hand. Beside him, Thomas hefted a heavy, unlit storm lantern. He measured the angle. Then he acted. He didn't drop it. He threw it, a heavy, downward arc. It struck the lantern in Madigan's hand with a tremendous crash of glass and metal. The barn was plunged back into total darkness, and Madigan roared in surprise, his hand now soaked in slippery lamp oil. The second man, in a panic, drew his pistol and fired a blind shot toward the loft. The muzzle flash was all Rowan needed. He had been waiting for it, not in the loft, but on one of the crossbeams. He dropped, landing on the packed earth just behind the shooter. The man spun, bringing his pistol around. He was too slow. Rowan, a master of his trade, didn't grab the man or the gun. He swung the heavy 18-inch iron tongs. With a clang, the jaws of the tongs clamped shut, not on the man's hand, but on the hot barrel and cylinder of the revolver. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of agony as the iron tongs locked, instantly transferring the heat of the gunshot, searing his own weapon into his hand. He tried to let go, but his fingers were already blistering to the grip. Rowan yanked, using the tongs to rip the weapon from the man's destroyed hand. At the same time, Tomas dropped from the loft like a cat, landing on Madigan's back. Madigan, slipping on the lamp oil, went down hard, and Thomas had a knife to his throat before he could even get his bearings. It was over in 5 seconds. The third man, hearing his companions scream, abandoned the window and fled into the night. They dragged their 2 captives into Cora's kitchen. They tied Madigan and his man to the heavy kitchen chairs. Madigan, his face bruised, glared at them with pure hatred. The other man was weeping, rocking, cradling his terribly burned hand. "He'll need a doctor," Lydia said, her voice shaking but firm. "He'll get one." "In jail," Rowan said, checking the man's pockets. "He's not carrying anything." He moved to Madigan. He frisked him, pulling out a knife, a box of matches, and a folded piece of paper. Cora took the paper and unfolded it under the lamp. Her blood ran cold. It was a bill of sale, a clumsy forgery, but a dangerous one. It was an agreement, claiming that Cora Vale, in exchange for $100, does hereby sell all water rights, including Ghost Lantern Spring, to the Renshaw Trust. It was pre-signed by a notary public in Sagewind. "My God," Jasper breathed, looking at it. This was their plan. They weren't just going to steal the maps. They were going to kill you. Leave this forgery and $100 on the table, and claim you sold out and left in the middle of the night. They were going to find this tomorrow, and the deputy on the ridge would swear he saw you ride out. Rowan finished, the true, dark nature of the plot settling over them. The night was almost gone. They locked their 2 captives in the root cellar, the heavy doors barred from the outside. The burned man's cries were muffled. In the kitchen, the sun was just beginning to tint the eastern sky. The air was gray and cold. Cora sat at the table, the precious wax paper tracings spread out before her. She took her sewing basket, threading a heavy needle with thick, brown thread. "We can't carry these in a box," she said, her voice low and steady. "They'll search our bags on the road. They'll find them." She picked up her heavy canvas riding skirt. She turned it inside out and, with quick, strong stitches, began to sew a flat, hidden pocket into the thick interior hem. Rowan watched her, his bandaged hands resting on the table. Cora, it's the only way. She finished the pocket, slid the folded tracings inside, and sewed the final seam shut with tight, overlapping stitches. She bit the thread with her teeth. She shook the skirt. The papers were invisible, a slight stiffness in the hem that no one would ever notice. "Let them search us," she said, her eyes meeting Rowan's. "There is no place a gentleman like Cutter or Deakins would ever dare to look." 2 hours later, they were on the road. Thomas, on his own horse, took a separate, hidden route, dragging the 2 captives behind him, bound and gagged. He would meet them in Juniper Pass. Cora, Rowan, Lydia, and Jasper rode in the reinforced wagon. They arrived in Juniper Pass by late afternoon. The town was buzzing, a major stop on the territorial circuit. They took rooms at the main hotel, overlooking the dusty square, just as they were unloading. A cavalry escort clattered into town, surrounding a large, formal carriage. "It's her," Jasper said, his voice hushed. "Judge Aurelia Stone." The carriage door opened, and a woman in a severe black traveling suit stepped out. She was not old, but she was not young. Her face was sharp, intelligent, and utterly unreadable. She moved with a purpose that scattered the curious onlookers. That evening, Jasper sat in the hotel window, his camera on its tripod, the long lens pointing at the saloon across the street. Deakins, Renshaw, and Sheriff Cutter were all inside, at a table near the window. Clearly visible, they were arguing. "They're nervous," Jasper whispered. "They know we've arrived, and their men haven't reported back." They watched as Deakins, his face a mask of fury, slid a small, heavy strongbox across the table to Sheriff Cutter. Cutter opened it. Even from across the street, they could see the dull, unmistakable gleam of gold coins, a payment or a bribe. Jasper, his movements calm and precise, made an adjustment to his focus. The light from the saloon's oil lamps was perfect. He slid a glass plate into the camera. "Hold still, gentlemen," he murmured. A small click echoed in the quiet hotel room. Jasper pulled the plate, his hands triumphant. "And that," he said, "is the final nail. They're not just conspirators, they're fools." The town settled into a tense, uneasy night. The hearing was set for the next morning. The air in Juniper Pass was hot, dry, and static. It felt thick, like the atmosphere before a massive sandstorm. When the world holds its breath, waiting for the first gust of wind to ignite the sky. The Juniper Pass grain warehouse had been hastily converted into a courtroom. Bales of hay served as a jury box, and Judge Aurelia Stone sat at a long trestle table set upon a raised platform, a territorial flag hanging limply behind her. The air was thick and heavy, a suffocating mixture of grain dust, sweat, and nervous anticipation. Every plank and bench was packed with the citizens of Ashwind Station and Sagewind ranchers, merchants, prospectors, and wives, all fanning their faces with paper fans, their eyes fixed on the proceedings. This was more than a hearing. It was a reckoning. Ephraim Deakins, Clint Renshaw, and Sheriff Cutter sat at a table to the right, looking confident. Deakins had hired a lawyer from the territorial capital, a man named Mr. Thorne, who was dressed in a fine wool suit despite the heat, his face smooth and condescending. Cora, Rowan, Lydia, and Jasper sat at a simple table on the left. They had no lawyer. Cora had decided she would speak for herself. Judge Stone banged her gavel, the sound a sharp crack in the hot, still air. "This hearing will come to order. This is a territorial inquiry into the disputed water rights of the property known as Ghost Lantern Spring. Mr. Thorne, you may begin." Thorne rose, his movements polished. "Thank you. Your Honor, the matter before this court is quite simple. My client, the Renshaw Trust, legally purchased the land and associated water rights in question on November 1st, 1880. He produced a document with a flourish. "We have here the official, notarized copy from the Sagewind County Records Office, clearly stating the trust's ownership. The opposing party, Miss Vale, has unfortunately been operating under a misunderstanding about the legacy of her father's former holdings." He handed the forged map to the clerk. Who passed it to Judge Stone? She examined it for a long moment, her face impassive. Miss Vale, the judge said, her voice clear and precise. Your response. Cora stood. She did not approach the judge's table. She stood where she was, her hands resting on the rough wood of her own. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the warehouse. Your Honor, that document is a forgery. A low murmur swept through the crowd. Thorne scoffed dramatically. That is a serious accusation, Miss Vale, the judge said, her eyes narrowing. Do you have proof? I do. Cora finally moved, walking to the clerk's table. She did not have the original ledger, but she had the next best thing. She unrolled the wax paper tracings she had made in the dark archive room. This, she said, pointing to the first tracing, is a copy of the original territorial survey ledger, filed by my father, Henry Vale, on October 14th, 1879. And this, she tapped the second tracing, is a copy of the document Mr. Thorne has just presented. She laid them side by side. They are not the same. The date is different, the name of the claimant is different, and the official county seal is different. Using a pencil, she pointed. On the original 1879 filing, the seal is sharp. On the 1880 forgery, the details are blurred, the ink pooled. It was made with a different, inferior stamp. She looked directly at Judge Stone. Someone removed the original page from the public ledger and replaced it with a lie. Thorne jumped to his feet. Objection! The fanciful drawings of a desperate woman are not evidence. Noted. Mr. Thorne. Please sit down, Judge Stone said, her eyes still fixed on the tracings. Miss Vale, do you have any other evidence to support this claim of a conspiracy? Yes, Your Honor, Cora said calmly. I call Mr. Jasper Quill to the stand. Jasper, clutching a wooden box, walked to the platform. After being sworn in, he opened the box and produced a glass photographic plate. Your Honor, I am the editor of the Juniper Times. The night before last, I witnessed a meeting at the saloon across the square. He held up the plate. I took this photograph. It shows Mr. Deakins, Mr. Renshaw, and Sheriff Cutter. It also shows Mr. Deakins handing Sheriff Cutter a strongbox. He produced a crisp, clear print. A strongbox which, as you can see, is filled with gold coin. He handed the photograph to the clerk. A wave of gasps and angry shouts erupted from the crowd. A bribe, someone yelled. Sheriff Cutter, who had been leaning back in his chair, shot upright, his face the color of wet ash. Deakins stared at the photograph, his composure finally cracking. Judge Stone banged her gavel repeatedly. Order, order in this court. When the noise subsided, her gaze, cold as a winter morning, fell on Cutter. Sheriff, you will have a chance to explain this transaction later. I have another witness, Cora said into the tense silence. Mr. Thomas Redleaf. Thomas moved with a quiet dignity that commanded the room's attention. He did not look at Deakins or Renshaw. He spoke directly to the judge. Your Honor, my people, the Ute, have lived in this land for a long time. Water is life. We do not mark it with paper. We mark it with stone. He explained the custom of building a specific type of cairn to mark a generational spring, a marker that was both a map and a sacred tribute. Henry Vale understood this. Thomas continued. He respected our ways. He built his own marker, in our fashion, by the spring on his land, as a sign of respect and as a permanent claim. Jasper produced another photograph, this one old and faded. It showed a younger Cora, a girl of about 10, standing beside her smiling father. Behind them, clear as day, was the stone cairn by the mouth of Ghost Lantern Spring. That marker stands to this day. Thomas finished. The stones do not lie. The evidence was building. A wall of truth, brick by brick. I call Mr. Rowan Pike. Cora said. Rowan took the stand. His presence was a stark contrast to the smirking lawyer and the flustered banker. He was solid, grounded. his bandaged hands a visible testament to the violence they had endured. He told the court about the night raid, about the attack in the barn, about the men who had come for the maps. "One of the men fired his weapon in the dark," Rowan said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "He missed." He reached into his pocket and placed a small, flattened piece of lead on the clerk's table. "I dug this from a rafter in Miss Vale's barn, directly above where I was standing. It is a .44 caliber slug. This was not a dispute over paper. Your Honor, this was an armed attack, intended to steal evidence and silence witnesses." Deakins, seeing his entire scheme unraveling, snapped. He stood up, his face contorted with rage. This is a circus, a collection of tall tales and emotional outbursts from a hysterical woman who couldn't manage her own property. She failed as a rancher, and now she's trying to salvage her pride by concocting these fantasies. "Mr. Deakins, you will sit down and be silent, or I will have the cavalry escort remove you." Judge Stone's voice was like the crack of a whip. "Your lawyer may speak, but you will not, Mr. Thorne. Control your client." She turned her sharp gaze back to Rowan. "Your testimony is noted. Mr. Pike." Cora took a deep breath. It was time for the final push. "Your Honor, I call Mr. Clint Renshaw to the stand." Renshaw swaggered to the platform, trying to project an air of bored indifference. He took the oath, his eyes avoiding Cora's. Cora held up the tracing of the 1880 forgery. "Mr. Renshaw, is this the document upon which your entire claim to Ghost Lantern Spring is based?" "It is," Renshaw grunted. "The official county record. And it is dated November 1st, 1880, is that correct?" "That's what it says. And it is signed by the chief clerk at the time, Mr. Jedediah Stanton." "Yes." Cora paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "That's very interesting, Mr. Renshaw, because according to the official minutes of the Territorial Council, on November 1st, 1880, Chief Clerk Stanton was in the capital, 200 miles from here, accepting an award for civic service. He was not in his office. He could not have signed that document." Renshaw's jaw dropped. He looked wildly at Deakins, who had gone completely pale. The crowd erupted again, this time with laughter and jeers. "And finally, Your Honor," Cora said, her voice ringing with triumph, "I call Mrs. Lydia Hart." Lydia, small but radiating confidence, took the stand. She carried a heavy, leather-bound ledger. "Your Honor, I am a dressmaker, but I am also a businesswoman. I believe in keeping good records. After Miss Vale informed me of the forged seal, I did some investigating." She opened the ledger. "This is the account book of Mr. Elias Thorne, the only metalsmith and engraver in Sagewind County at the time. He is now deceased, but his son maintains his records." She ran her finger down a page. "On November 15th, 1882, full weeks after the date on the Renshaw Trust's document, there is an entry. It is a cash payment, made by a man described only as a representative from the bank, for the commission of one new county seal." She looked up, her gaze finding Deakins and pinning him to his chair. The entry notes that the commission was a rush order, and that the resulting stamp was, in the engraver's own words, "a poor copy, lacking the fine detail of the original." She closed the book with a solid, final thud. The seal on the forged document was not created until 2 weeks after it was supposedly used. It was over. The case was not just proven. It was demolished. The air in the warehouse was electric. Judge Stone held up a hand for silence. Her face was grim. "This court has heard sufficient evidence to conclude that a conspiracy of fraud, intimidation, and violent assault has been perpetrated by the principals of the Renshaw Trust and the Ashwind Station Bank, with the complicity of the county sheriff." She stood. "This hearing is in recess while I prepare my verdict. The cavalry escort will maintain order in this town. No one involved in this case is to leave Juniper Pass." Deakins didn't wait to be escorted. As the crowd erupted into a chaotic roar, he slipped from his chair and, using the confusion as cover, melted out of a side door of the warehouse. He was a ruined man, His bank, his reputation, his charter all gone. He had nothing left to lose, and in his mind, a final, desperate, and spiteful plan was forming. If he couldn't have the water, no one would. He would burn the Vale Ranch to the ground before the verdict was even read. Across the chaotic room, Rowan caught Cora's eye. The relief on her face was immense, but he could see the exhaustion underneath. He knew Deakins. He knew this wasn't over. He didn't have to speak. He just looked at her. Then his gaze flickered meaningfully toward the door through which Deakins had vanished. The fight has changed. Cora's expression shifted. The relief vanished, replaced by a cold, hard understanding. The legal victory was won, but the physical war for her home was about to begin. Rowan saw the shift in her and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. A question and a statement in one. "It's coming. Are you ready?" He saw her answer in the way she straightened her shoulders, in the way her hands, no longer trembling, curled into fists at her sides. He gave her a new set of priorities with his eyes, a silent, grim promise. If they bring fire, we save the people first, the cattle second. The ranch is just wood. Cora nodded back. A single, sharp dip of her chin. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were now as bright and sharp as a polished blade. The fight was not over. It was just moving to the final battleground. They did not wait for the verdict. The moment the recess was called, the moment Deakins vanished, a shared, unspoken understanding passed between Cora and Rowan. This was not over. They left the courthouse at a run. Grabbing Lydia and Jasper, the journey from Juniper Pass back to the ranch was a frantic, desperate race against a certainty. They were not riding to a celebration. They were riding to a war. They arrived under a moonless, starless sky. The night was absolute, a black, suffocating blanket that swallowed sound and light. The air was unnaturally still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. They left Lydia and Jasper in the main house, a fortress now, with heavy shutters bolted and the doors barred. Tomas had already met them a mile out, a silent shadow materializing from the darkness. He had left his prisoners secured with the cavalry patrol and had circled back. He took up a watch on the low ridge, his rifle cradled in his arms. Cora and Rowan went to the red barn. They did not light a lantern. They stood in the familiar darkness, the scent of hay and horse a strange comfort in the charged air. "He'll come for the barn first," Cora whispered, her voice a ghost in the vast space. "It's the heart of the ranch, the oldest part. He'll want to see it burn." "We'll be ready," Rowan said, his voice a low rumble beside her. He had a heavy fire axe in his hands. The attack, when it came, was both silent and sudden. There were no hoofbeats, no shouts, just the faintest scrape of a boot on gravel. From the Hayloft window, Cora saw two figures, moving low and fast. They carried heavy cans. She smelled it before she saw it, the sharp, unmistakable reek of kerosene. The figures separated, one circling the barn to the left, the other to the right, methodically splashing the dark, flammable liquid against the dry, 100-year-old timber walls. It was Deakins and Luke Madigan, ruined and vengeful. They had come to enact their final, spiteful act of destruction. Before Cora could even shout a warning, a third figure appeared. He struck a match. The tiny flame was a monstrous, terrifying star in the darkness. He tossed it. The old wood of the red barn did not catch fire. It detonated. A low whoosh became a roaring inferno in a single heartbeat. A wall of orange flame clawed its way up the side of the barn, illuminating the entire ranch yard in a hellish, dancing light. The cattle, safe in the corral, screamed. It was a sound of pure, animal terror. The bells on their necks began to clang. A frantic, dissonant alarm. The gate. Cora yelled, already scrambling down the loft ladder. "We have to get them out!" The plan they had made in the panicked ride from town went into effect. Rowan didn't follow her. He grabbed a long grappling hook and a heavy, pre-soaked canvas tarp and began to climb. Not the ladder, but the internal support beams. heading for the roof. Cora burst from the side door of the barn, her face already scorched by the heat. The fire was spreading with terrifying speed. "Lydia, Jasper, the cattle!" she screamed toward the house. She sprinted to the main corral gate. Madigan, his face a demonic mask in the firelight, stood in her way, a heavy club in his hand. He was between her and the gate's latch. The main doors of the ranch house burst open. Jasper and Lydia ran out, not with fear, but with a determined fury. Jasper held a heavy iron skillet. Lydia, a cast-iron poker from the fireplace. "Get the side gate," Cora yelled, not taking her eyes off Madigan. "Drive them to the north pasture." As Jasper and Lydia ran to do her bidding, Cora faced her attacker. He lunged, swinging the club. Cora, with no time to think, grabbed the nearest tool, a long-tined pitchfork leaning against the wall. She met his clumsy, downward swing with a sharp, upward thrust. The steel tines of the fork caught the wooden club, the impact jarring her to the bone. She twisted, using the leverage of the long handle, and ripped the club from his grasp. Madigan stared at his empty hands in disbelief. Cora didn't hesitate. She reversed the pitchfork and swung the heavy wooden shaft like a quarterstaff, catching him hard across the knees. He went down with a howl of pain. Before he could recover, before he could reach for the long knife she knew was sheathed at his belt, Rowan was there. He dropped from the low eaves of the barn roof, landing between Cora and the fallen man, the heavy fire axe held ready in his hands. He was a terrifying figure, silhouetted against the flames, his face grim and resolute. Madigan, seeing him, scrambled backward in the mud and fled into the darkness. On the roof, Rowan's battle was just beginning. The shingles were already scorching hot, the air a blast furnace of smoke and embers. He could see the heart of the fire, where the thrown match had landed in a pile of loose straw near the main wall. He scrambled across the steep pitch of the roof, his boots slipping, the heat blistering. He braced himself against the chimney stack, hooked the wet tarp, and with a desperate heave, dragged it over the worst of the flames. The effect was immediate. A huge cloud of steam and black smoke billowed into the sky, and the fire, for a moment, was smothered. But it was a temporary victory. Embers, like angry red hornets, rained down, burning small holes in his shirt, searing his skin. One landed on his bandaged hand, and he hissed in pain as the linen began to smolder. He beat it out against the shingles, his teeth gritted. Below, the ranch yard was a scene of organized chaos. Lydia had the side gate open, and Jasper, waving a blanket, was helping Cora drive the terrified, lowing cattle out of the corral and away from the fire. Suddenly, Lydia screamed. She had run back toward the barn, her eyes fixed on a small wooden crate just inside the main doors. The crate containing Jasper's glass plates, the physical evidence from the trial. As she grabbed it, a flaming beam from the doorway crashed to the ground, blocking her exit and setting the crate itself alight. She was trapped. Jasper, seeing her, didn't shout. He ran. He vaulted over the low corral fence, grabbed a discarded horse blanket, and plunged it into the water trough, soaking it. He ran toward the wall of flame, holding the heavy, dripping blanket in front of him like a shield. He pushed through the fire, a momentary, terrifying silhouette, and grabbed Lydia, pulling her and the smoldering crate back out just as the doorway began to collapse. From the darkness, a rifle shot rang out. A puff of dirt exploded near Jasper's feet. It was Dakins. He was near the house, trying to cut them off, to sow panic, but he had forgotten about Tomas. From the ridge, a second shot answered. A sharp, clean report that was entirely different. It was not aimed at Deakins. It was aimed at the rifle in his hands. A loud metallic ping echoed across the yard, and Deakins's rifle was ripped from his grasp, spinning into the mud. Tomas was not a killer. He was a protector. The main battle was now at the barn. The fire, beaten back by Rowan's tarp, was now eating its way through the interior. The ancient, dry timbers were catching, the flames crawling up the support posts toward the hayloft. The roof, which had been Rowan's perch, was now a death trap. He scrambled back toward the loft window just as the main crossbeam, the one that held the entire roof together, groaned, sagged, and then burst into a shower of sparks and flame. The whole structure was going to go. Cora, having seen the last of the cattle safely away, ran back into the barn, her eyes wild, searching for Rowan. "Rowan, get out! The loft!" he yelled, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "It's the only way." He dropped from the roof into the hayloft, the floor already hot beneath his boots. The smoke was a thick, choking blanket, making it impossible to see or breathe. He grabbed the heavy rope they used for hoisting hay bales, secured one end to a thick post, and threw the other end out the Hayloft window. Cora scrambled up the ladder, the rungs already hot to the touch. She burst into the loft just as the fire broke through the floorboards in a hungry, roaring wave. The entire space was an inferno of swirling smoke and flame. The corner where they had kissed, where they had found shelter from the storm, was now the heart of the fire. "The rope!" Rowan yelled, grabbing her arm. He was a dark shape in the swirling orange chaos. He shoved her toward the window. "Go get down." Cora looked from his face to the rope, then back again. The floor beneath them shuddered. She saw the raw determination in his eyes. He would push her out if he had to. He would save her, even if it meant he wouldn't have time to save himself. She shook her head, her braid coming loose, her hair a wild halo in the firelight. "No," she choked out, her voice raw. "Together." She grabbed the rope with one hand and his arm with the other, her grip like iron. There was no time to argue. He understood. He wrapped his arms around her, his larger body shielding her from the worst of the heat. And together, they launched themselves out of the window. The rope burned their hands. They slid, half falling, a single, intertwined form, and landed in a bruising heap in the soft, muddy flower bed her mother had planted years ago. They rolled apart, gasping for air, their lungs on fire, their faces black with soot. Behind them, with a final, deafening roar, the roof of the red barn collapsed inward, sending a volcano of sparks and flaming debris into the night sky. They lay there, stunned, watching the heart of the ranch die, and then they heard the slow, deliberate clopping of a single horse. Sheriff Boaz Cutter sat on his mount at the edge of the firelight, his face a mask of cold satisfaction. He made no move to help. He made no move to offer aid. He simply sat there, watching them, a vulture waiting for the carrion. He had come not to enforce the law, but to witness its final, fiery desecration. Cora stared at him, a new, cold hatred rising through her exhaustion. But before she could speak, a new sound cut through the night. It was a shout, then another, then the rumble of a heavy wagon. A procession of lanterns was bobbing down the road from town. Jasper, having seen Cutter arrive, had taken Lydia's buckboard and raced back, not to the judge, but to the people. A crowd of ranchers and townspeople, the same people who had packed the courtroom, poured into the yard. They carried buckets, shovels, and wet blankets. They were no longer spectators. They had read Jasper's paper. They had heard the testimony. They had chosen a side. Without a word, they formed a bucket brigade, stretching from the water trough to the burning barn, their faces grim and determined in the firelight. Cutter, seeing the tide of public opinion turn into a literal, physical force, knew he was finished. He pulled his horse's head around and spurted into the darkness, a coward fleeing the community he had betrayed. At the same time, two figures emerged from the shadows near the house, propelled by the silent, imposing form of Tomas Redleaf. It was Deakins and Madigan, their hands bound, their faces a mixture of terror and defeat. Thomas, having disabled Deakins, had simply waited and had taken them both without a sound. He shoved them toward the assembled townspeople. "This is the town's business now," Tomas said, and melted back into the shadows. The fight was over. The fire, though it had claimed the barn, was being contained by the determined efforts of their neighbors. The villains were captured. Cora got to her feet, her body a single, screaming ache. Rowan stood beside her. They were covered in soot and mud. Their clothes were scorched, and they were breathing in the bitter, heartbreaking smell of their own history turning to ash. She turned to him. In the flickering light of the dying fire, she saw the burns on his hands, the deep gash on his cheek where a piece of falling timber had grazed him. She saw the absolute, bone-deep weariness in his eyes, and she saw the unwavering strength that had held her, shielded her, and refused to leave her behind. She didn't say anything. She simply stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. He flinched from the pain of his burns, but then his own arms came around her, holding her tightly, his cheek pressed against the top of her head. They stood there, two survivors, a small, solid island in a sea of ash and ruin, while the last of the embers hissed and died around them. "It's gone," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The barn, it's all gone." "No," Rowan murmured into her hair, his voice rough. "The house is standing. The well is safe. The cattle are in the north pasture." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her soot-stained face. "The ranch is still here because we are still here." She looked into his eyes and saw the truth of it. The red barn was wood and nails. The ranch, the real ranch, was the iron will that resided in them both. The first hint of dawn was breaking, a pale, gray light that revealed the full extent of the devastation. The red barn was a skeleton, a black, smoldering framework against the morning sky. The yard was a churned mess of mud and ash. But through the quiet, mournful silence, a new sound emerged, a soft, steady, liquid music. It was the rhythmic clank gurgle splash of the pump Rowan had fixed. Through the fire, through the fight, through the darkest night, it had never stopped. The spring was still flowing. Its clean, clear water, the source of their entire struggle, was pouring into the trough, washing away the ash, reflecting the first light of a new day. It was not the sound of an ending. It was the sound of an oath, a promise that life, like the water, would continue. The formal verdict was delivered the following day, but it was merely a public confirmation of what everyone already knew. Judge Aurelia Stone, her face set like granite, read her findings in a clear, unwavering voice that filled the silent grain warehouse. The 1880 document filed by the Renshaw Trust was declared fraudulent and void. The original 1879 territorial filing was upheld, and the unassailable ownership of Ghost Lantern Spring and the surrounding Vale Ranch lands was reaffirmed to Cora Vale. Ephraim Deakins, Luke Madigan, and Sheriff Boaz Cutter, having been apprehended by the cavalry patrol on the road from the Vale Ranch, were stripped of their authority and formally taken into federal custody. They were to be held without bail, awaiting a territorial circuit trial on charges of conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder, and arson. Their ruin was total and absolute. Clint Renshaw, through his smirking lawyer, managed to avoid the federal charges by claiming he had been a victim of Deacon's financial machinations. But Judge Stone's justice was practical and sharp. She did not send him to jail. She hit him where it hurt his wallet. Renshaw was found civilly liable for the actions of his employee, Luke Madigan. He was ordered to pay full and immediate restitution for the stolen cattle and for the complete reconstruction of the Red Barn. To ensure payment, a lien was placed on his own vast land holdings. The cattle baron, for the first time in his life, was collared by the very law he had sought to twist. The victory was quiet. There was no cheering in the courtroom, only a deep, collective sigh of relief, as if a long and painful fever had finally broken. As Cora walked out into the bright, clean sunlight, she didn't feel elation. She felt a profound, bone-deep stillness, the quiet that comes after a long and terrible storm. The true victory was not in the words of the judge, but in what happened next. 2 days later, as Cora and Rowan stood looking at the blackened, skeletal remains of the barn, a wagon appeared on the road, then another, then a third. By noon, a small caravan of townspeople had arrived at the Vale Ranch. They were the same ranchers who had once whispered about her, the same merchants who had watched her with pity. They came not as spectators, but as builders. They brought lumber salvaged from old sheds. They brought kegs of nails. They brought saws and hammers and strong arms. They did not ask for permission. They simply started working. The sound of hammers striking nails began to echo across the valley, a steady, rhythmic percussion. It was not the sound of construction. It was the sound of a community's heart, beating back to life. Lydia Hart arrived not with a hammer, but with her sewing machine and 3 massive bolts of canvas. She set up a station near the house and organized the women. "Mr. Renshaw is paying for the wood," she announced, her voice sharp and clear. "But a barn needs a good roof. Any woman who sews a section of tarp gets a new dress, a new shirt for her husband, or her mending done for a month. On me." She had started a fund, trading her skill for theirs, weaving the community back together, stitch by stitch. Jasper Quill's contribution arrived with the weekly mail. He had printed a special edition of the Juniper Times. The entire front page was a single, stark photograph of the burned-out barn. Below it, the headline was 4 words, set in the largest type he owned: "Not for sale, not for steal. Every homesteader, every rancher in the county received a copy." It was a declaration that the age of the predator was over. On the 3rd day of the rebuilding, Thomas Redleaf appeared. He carried a small, sharp axe and a seasoned piece of cottonwood. He went to the spring, to the stone cairn his people and Cora's father had honored. He spent the day carving. He did not carve a face or a beast. He carved a simple, elegant spiral, the symbol of flowing water and new beginnings. He set the small totem beside the cairn, a new marker for a new era. Cora brought him a cool cup of water from the spring. She had no words for her gratitude, so she simply placed a hand on his arm. He nodded, a silent understanding passing between them that was deeper than any language. Rowan worked tirelessly. He was not a carpenter, but he was a master of structure and form. He directed the raising of the main beams, his voice calm and steady amid the chaotic symphony of construction. He spent his own time at his portable forge, hammering out new hinges, new gate latches, new braces of black iron that were stronger and truer than the ones that had burned. A week later, the main structure was complete. The new red barn stood on the ashes of the old, its fresh-cut pine smelling of resilience and sap. Rowan had just finished hanging the new main doors. He swung one shut. It closed with a soft, satisfying thump, the latch catching perfectly. There was no creak, no groan of old, tired wood. It was a sound of quiet, solid peace. Cora, who had been watching him, smiled. It was the first genuine, untroubled smile he had ever seen from her. "It's so quiet," she said. "New hinges," he replied, wiping his hands on his trousers. "No," she said, her eyes meeting his. "The sound, it's as quiet as my own heart is now." That evening, as the sun began to dip below the sharp peaks of Haymaker Ridge, they walked. They didn't ride. They led Salt Cedar by the reins, the stallion nuzzling Cora's shoulder, his white coat gleaming in the golden light. They climbed the familiar path to the top of the ridge, the same place where their long fight had begun. The wind was gentle, a soft whisper through the tall meadow grass. It caught the hem of Cora's skirt, making it dance around her ankles. They stood for a long time in silence, looking down at the valley below. They could see the new, unpainted roof of the red barn. They could see the small, dark shapes of the returned cattle, grazing peacefully in the north pasture. They could see the thin, silver ribbon of Ghost Lantern Spring, winking in the last of the sunlight. Cora leaned her head against Rowan's shoulder. His arm came around her, a familiar, comfortable weight. "I've been thinking about what comes next," she said quietly. "Rebuilding the herd," he guessed. "Planting new hay." "Yes," she said. "That, but something else, too." She took a breath. "I was lucky. I had you. I had Lydia and Jasper and Thomas. Most women out here, they don't have that. They're alone when their husband dies. Or when a man like Deakins comes along. They lose everything. They don't know how to fight." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with a fierce, new purpose. "I want to change that. I want to start something. A school. Maybe, Not for reading and writing, but for other things. I want to teach the daughters of the ranchers in this valley how to properly hold the reins of a horse, how to shoot a rifle straight and true, how to read a land deed and understand every word. I want to teach them how to hold their own ground, so they never have to depend on the mercy of a man. Rowan listened, his expression unreadable. She had expected him to be surprised, perhaps even resistant to such a radical idea. Instead, when she was finished, a slow, deep smile spread across his face. He looked at her with an expression of such profound admiration that it took her breath away. "I figured it would be something like that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He hesitated, a flicker of uncharacteristic nervousness in his eyes. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, beautifully crafted wooden box. Cora's heart gave a sudden, sharp kick. "Cora," he began, his voice a low rumble. "We talked about what comes after, about the future." He held out the box. It was not the velvet box of a jeweler. It was made of dark, polished walnut, with a small, hand-forged iron latch. Her hands trembled slightly as she took it from him. She lifted the latch. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark blue cloth, was not a ring. It was a seal, a heavy, brass seal, mounted on a turned wooden handle. It was brand new, the engraving sharp and deep. She lifted it, the weight of it solid and real in her palm. She angled it to the fading light to read the letters carved into its face. They were set in a circle, and in the center, a simple, elegant spiral, the symbol of flowing water Thomas had carved. The words around the edge read, "Bale Spring Cooperative." She stared at it, her throat tight. He hadn't just listened to her dream. He had forged it into a reality. He wasn't asking her to be his wife. He was asking her to be his partner, in a venture that was entirely, completely hers. He was giving her not a symbol of possession, but a tool of empowerment. She couldn't speak. The words were trapped behind a sudden, overwhelming wave of love and gratitude. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. He was watching her, his own heart in his eyes, waiting. Her answer was not a word. She launched herself into his arms, her own wrapping around his neck, pulling him down to her. The look in her eyes was all the yes he would ever need. He met her kiss, and it was different from the one in the hayloft. That had been a kiss of discovery, of shelter from a storm. This was a kiss of beginning, of a future built on a foundation of respect and shared strength. It was as soft as the meadow grass beneath their feet, and as long as the evening shadows stretching across the valley. It was a kiss of absolute certainty, a quiet, consensual promise made in the golden light of the setting sun. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, a new sound drifted up from the valley below. It was the long, mournful whistle of the evening train, its sound bending around the curves of the distant hills. For years, that sound had been a symbol of the encroaching world, of the forces of greed and progress that had threatened to swallow her whole. But tonight, the sound was different. The train was on the far side of the valley. Its path, which would have once cut straight through the heart of her land under Deakins' plan, had been rerouted. The world was learning, the town, the territory, the railroad. They were all learning to go around the things they could not buy, could not break, and could not steal. They were learning to respect a woman's dignity. The wind that swept down from Haymaker Ridge that night was warm, carrying the sweet, clean scent of cut alfalfa and distant pine. It was a wind of healing, a soft breath that promised the end of the long, dry season. It moved through the open doors of the new red barn, a structure that stood not as a replacement for the old one, but as a testament to it. The raw, pale lumber of its walls still smelled of the forest, a fresh, sharp scent of sap and new beginnings that mingled with the timeless aroma of hay and horses. There were no ghosts here. The fire had taken the old sorrows, the years of solitary struggle, and reduced them to ash. What had risen in their place was solid, true, and built by the hands of a community that had found its own heart again. Cora and Rowan stood in the wide central aisle, the soft lantern light making the new wood glow like honey. The work was done. The last of the tools had been put away. The horses, including Salt Cedar, were settled in their new, spacious stalls, their soft munching a peaceful, rhythmic sound in the quiet. "It feels bigger than the old one," Cora said, her voice a soft murmur in the vast, still space. "The frame is the same," Rowan replied, his own voice a low, resonant rumble. "Maybe what's inside it has grown." He looked at her, and she met his gaze. There was no more tension, no more fear. In its place was a deep, quiet understanding, a comfort so profound it needed no words. He held out his hand. She took it, her calloused fingers lacing with his. His hand, no longer bandaged, was a map of his life, the hard ridges of the smith, the faint scars of the soldier, and now, the familiar, warm strength of her partner. "Come on," he said softly. He led her not toward the house, but toward the ladder to the hayloft. It was the same ladder she had scrambled up in a panic, the same rungs that had been scorched by the fire, but now it was new, the wood smooth and strong under her hands. They climbed into the loft, a space reborn. The air was warm and smelled intoxicatingly of fresh, sweet hay. A single storm lantern, a twin to the one that had lit their first kiss, hung from a central beam, its gentle, golden light pooling on the floor, leaving the high corners in deep, peaceful shadow. The high window, once an escape route from an inferno, was now a perfect, dark square framing a sliver of the moonless sky. This was their sanctuary. It had been consecrated by fear, and now it was being reconsecrated by peace. Cora walked to one of the massive crossbeams that supported the roof, a thick, squared-off length of pine that was wide enough to sit on. The memory of the fire was a ghost here, a faint tremor in the air, but it had no power over them. She hitched up the heavy fabric of her skirt just enough to give her the freedom to sit comfortably, her bare feet resting on a lower beam. The gesture was practical, unthinking, yet it held a new, easy intimacy. Rowan sat beside her, his solid presence a comfort and an anchor. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She leaned against him, her head finding the familiar, perfect place on his shoulder, her body fitting against his as if it were made to be there. She let out a long, slow sigh. "Tomorrow," she whispered, her voice full of a quiet, wondrous energy. "Tomorrow we'll raise the sign, the one you made." She could feel the smile in his voice as he replied, "It'll need a strong post. I've already seasoned the oak for it." "Vale Spring Cooperative?" she murmured, tasting the words. "It sounds so real, so permanent." "It is," he said, his arm coming around her, his hand resting securely on her waist. She turned her head, her cheek brushing against the rough fabric of his shirt. "I remember the first day you came here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You said you bought me time. It's all I had to give you then. It was everything," she said. She lifted her head and looked at him, her eyes catching the soft lantern light. "Tonight," she said, her voice thick with an emotion so deep it was almost painful, "I'm repaying you. With a shared future." The words hung in the warm, hay-scented air between them. They were a vow, a promise that went beyond any legal deed or paper contract. He didn't answer with words. He answered by leaning in, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away, though they both knew she never would. His kiss was not a question this time, but a confirmation. It was gentle, unhurried, and full of a quiet, certain joy. Their bodies, which had once met in desperation and fear, now moved in a slow, graceful rhythm of trust. His hand moved from her waist to the small of her back, a steady, supportive pressure that grounded her, that told her she was safe. Her own hand came to rest flat against his chest, directly over his heart. She closed her eyes, focusing on the slow, powerful, steady beat beneath her palm. It was the truest rhythm in the world, the beat of his life, and it was here, with her. The kiss ended. But they did not part. They stayed close, their foreheads touching, their breath mingling in the small, warm space between them. He lowered his head, his lips tracing a slow, warm path along her jawline. A tender exploration of the skin he had once seen streaked with soot and tears. She shivered, not from cold, but from the exquisite, gentle intimacy of the touch. She tilted her head back, a silent invitation, and his kisses moved to the sensitive skin of her throat, each touch a soft, reverent punctuation mark in their silent conversation. This was not a firestorm of passion. It was the deep, glowing warmth of an eternal hearth. It was two solitary souls, two fighters who had stood back to back against the world, finally turning to face each other, realizing they were home. It was the quiet, profound, and breathtaking discovery that the safety they had been fighting for was not a piece of land, but a place in each other's arms. The warm night wind, finding its way through the high window, made the storm lantern sway gently on its hook. The single unified shadow of their two bodies, locked in a quiet embrace, moved on the far wooden wall. It was a living hieroglyph, a story of union and resilience etched in light and shadow, a permanent carving on the walls of their new life. From the world below, another sound drifted up, a soft, constant murmur that was the soul of the ranch itself. It was the sound of Ghost Lantern Spring, flowing freely from the earth, whispering its way through the stone channel they had dug in the dark. It was the sound of justice won, of freedom reclaimed. It was the lifeblood of the land, a testament to the fact that they had not just saved a place, but had earned the right to belong to it. Cora, her head resting in the hollow of Rowan's shoulder, her ear pressed against his chest, listened to the two sounds, the steady beat of his heart and the gentle murmur of the spring. They were the same song. "No longer lonely," she whispered, the words a soft puff of breath against his skin. He tightened his arm around her, pulling her impossibly closer. "No longer alone," he replied, his voice a low, rough vow in the quiet of the loft. A soft, shared laugh escaped them both, a breathless sound of pure, unadulterated happiness. They leaned their heads together. Two survivors, two partners, two lovers, their long battle finally, truly over. The climax of their fight for revenge, for the land, for the water, for a name had seamlessly, beautifully, merged into the climax of a love they had forged in fire and trial. They had won. They had won it all. Outside, the wind moved through the high grass of the pastures, turning the fields to a sea of shifting silver under the faint starlight. The Vale Ranch, quiet and peaceful, settled into the night. It was not for sale. It never had been. It never would be. The camera of the mind pulls back, leaving the two figures in their quiet embrace. The last thing we see is the gentle, golden light spilling from the hayloft window. The last thing we hear is the soft, musical murmur of the spring and the slow, even peaceful breathing of two people, finally at rest, in the warm, hay-scented shadows, their new life, just beginning. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.